Welcome to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is indeed my show. I hope you guys are doing all right this morning. Dark day, dark day. And what I mean by dark day, give me one second. I want to check something to make sure everything is going right. And yes. Yes, all right. Yeah, dark day. Dark day, to put it mildly. The reality of it is Syria has fallen. Syria has fallen. It has utterly collapsed. Collapse is an understatement, frankly. Not just collapse. If it was a ball, it would have hit the ground and it would have bounced. The reality of it is the Syrian military didn't fight. That is the most confusing aspect of this, I would argue. All things being equal, we were getting all sorts of reports from the Syrian military that they were still fighting, that they were still putting up a fight, that they were standing strong. Don't believe the reports from the terrorists that are coming after us. We are still here. We're in the city center. And city after city after city fell. In 2 weeks, the Syrian army effectively disintegrated like it was tissue paper hit by water. And, you know, it leaves a bit of melancholy. I never really make arguments for leaders of particular countries. Very rarely will you hear me make this kind of rah-rah of a particular leader. Usually, my thing is I look at Libya, I look at Iraq, and I look at what happened to those countries when those countries fell. All hell broke loose, and the civilian populations in those countries suffered the most. Jelani, the one that took over, has a $10 million bounty by the US government itself. And yet, everybody knew where he was because he was involved in violently overthrowing the country. And yet, the US acted more like the Air Force, taking out anybody that was even trying to assist coming from somewhere like Iraq or something like that. This is the US Embassy. This is the US Embassy. This is their own, right here. The core of HTS is Nusra, a designated terrorist organization. The designation applies regardless of what name it uses or what it merges into. Again, back in 2007, HTS is a merger, and any group that merges into it becomes part of Al-Qaeda, Syria's network. Let's keep going. We remain committed to bringing leading AQS figure in HTS to justice. This is the diversity-friendly terrorists that has just taken over Syria. That has just taken over Syria. And yes, stop this terrorist. There was a reward of $10 million for his arrest or kill, I suppose. That is guy that is now in charge. And I've spoken to people that were on the ground. I've spoken to people who have family members on the ground. They are terrified. They are completely and utterly terrified. I've even seen reports of Christian areas, churches being looted, people being harassed, etc. Now, he is playing this angle of, I'm diversity friendly. I just want to live and let live. I know I used to chop off heads. I know I used to kill Americans, but I don't do that anymore. I'm now a different guy. The Syrian military took their weapons, put their weapons down, and fled to Iraq in many respects. I didn't see this fighting and this holding the line. If you think back to Ukraine, even when Zelensky would tell them and send them to a place to die, they would often stand there, fight, and die. And if you think back to 2007, the Syrian government held on like grim death. Assad, even after losing massive amounts of territory, wouldn't leave, wouldn't resign, and fought and clung to power. This time around, not so much. Not so much. They fled, they left. And Assad himself got on an airplane, flew to Moscow, where he was invited and welcomed by the Russians. Russia put out a tweet or something saying we don't leave our allies behind, in which case they brought Assad into the government. People are rightly confused. It took, what, decades? I mean, like I point out, in 2007, they fought and clung to power. This time around, as they were losing city after city after city after city, people were confused at how they were losing cities that fast and at that speed. The other interesting part to this was the Russians. Russia was putting on heavy bombing campaigns, but truth be told, if Syria is not going to fight, Russia can't necessarily fight the war for Syria if Syria is not going to fight for itself. There was the conversation in the meeting in Doha, and in that meeting in Doha, I would imagine there was a massive amount of frustration coming from the Russian side of it. They had the Astana agreements. The Astana agreements were three-part agreements between Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Russia on this issue of stability in the region. Idlib, as I think Mark pointed out, was a cancerous wound that was occupied by tens of thousands. The UN recounted it being 40 to 50,000 terrorists that were in Idlib. But the deal that was made was under this idea that it will remain stable. So you can imagine Russia's shock or surprise when all of these terrorists come screaming out of Syria or out of Idlib into other parts of Syria, in which case there seemed to be uprisings and everything else as they were attacking, meaning there seemed to have been people in Syria or jihadis already pre-planned in Syria for the uprising to kick off, so they were being attacked from without and, for that matter, from within. Um, the Doha talks are super interesting to me because for the longest time, the Russians wouldn't necessarily blame Turkey directly, or they wouldn't blame Erdogan. And not just wouldn't blame Erdogan, they would talk about it in this kind of way of, look, we know that you're backing these guys, but we're not going to say it because ultimately we still want to negotiate with you. And so when the Doha negotiations took place, I would imagine that they thought they would get something out of it. But at a certain point, it became pretty clear that they weren't going to get much out of it. And there was this question about whether or not what they got out of Doha was protection for their bases, because Russia still has military bases in the region. And so all of those things are questions that are just kind of looming. The reason why I say I don't necessarily I don't boost up world leaders is because the reality of it is I don't live in those places. And people could have legitimate reasons and gripes with the leadership of a particular country. Lord knows I have gripes with the leadership of my own country. That doesn't necessarily mean that I want a terrorist group to come in, chop off heads, and put in some kind of fascist state over top of it. I think that's a worse outcome. And again, when I point to the other countries that we have done this to in the past, the outcomes have not been that great. The outcomes have been complete and utter chaos. And so you can imagine a bit of fear and trepidation that is felt by either the Christians, the Alawites, or any other minority group that is in Syria right now that knows that the last time this happened, many of those people got beheaded, many of those people got killed, many of those people got singled out in this kind of fascist state. So when I say it is a dark day, it is not because I think Assad is great. It's more so because I don't necessarily want the people in Syria, just like I don't want the people in any other country, to be put under a fascist regime where those people will most likely be under threat and terror, just like they are now. It's that. And I feel that way about any country. Whether it's Trump trying to overthrow America, whether it's us paying kill squads, whether it's us knocking over Libya, whether it's us knocking over Iraq. I would say the outcomes, it's not worth the chaos and the damage that you cause to those populations. And truth be told, you may get a better outcome over time as opposed to this blunt force, kill them all, create all sorts of chaos and havoc. And then there's this other question of, for one, they are trying to reshape the image of a terrorist that has killed Americans, that has has a $10 million bounty out for him, apparently, that we have called a terrorist for decades. And that now Joe Biden is even talking about removing the bounty that's on his head. We have been instrumental working through intelligence channels funding the terrorists in this region. The Turks have funded and backed the terrorists in this region. You might as well say NATO backed. Israel has funded and backed the terrorists in this region. And all of them had something out of it that they wanted. From the US standpoint, they wanted to, A, damage an ally of Russia. There's that. But they also wanted to benefit Israel in this context of damaging this capability of moving arms and support for Hezbollah through Syria. If you can destroy Syria, or if you can put a regime in Syria that, let's say, is antagonistic to Hezbollah, or for that matter, to the causes of the quote-unquote axis of resistance, then you can fundamentally damage it in a way that may be irreparable. From the standpoint of the Turks, they wanted territory. And the standpoint of Israel, they wanted to create this greater Israel, which they did, by the way. Israel has expanded already into Syria. In fact, as soon as the government fell, they had already expanded into Syria. I want to bring in my guests. Let me do this first. There we are. Let's bring in my guests. We are joined by the one and only Mark Sleboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. Mark, man, you are the person to talk to today. I am super curious about your take on events. How you doing today?
Jamarl, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure on the show, and I'm pretty shocked, horrified, and depressed.
Yeah, same here. I have a sense of melancholy. In fact, I had a sense of melancholy about it all weekend because I have my former producer has family there. And some of the people that we've brought onto the show have family there, and all of them are absolutely terrified. There's this weird chest thumping in the West for a guy who's literally on our terrorist watch list with a $10 million bounty on his head that is just taking power. So, yeah, I guess my first question to you is, how on earth did the Syrian army collapse that fast? Over 2 weeks? It was almost like tissue paper just crumbling up from a band of rebels. What happened in this?
Okay, so, I mean, there's going to be a lot of retroactive analysis, a lot of blame storming between Russia and Iran and, Syrians who regret the fall of the Syrian government over exactly what has happened. So let's review what we know. So there was a freeze of the conflict in Syria. There has never been an end to the Syrian conflict. There has never been any formal peace deal. There was a freeze of the Syrian conflict, or at least two sides of the Syrian conflict, worked out under the auspices of what was called the Astana framework, after the capital of Kazakhstan, where the process began. And this was between Russia and Iran on one side, representing the Syrian government, and their ally Hezbollah, who was also involved in the conflict. And the other side of it was represented by Turkey, which represented Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Free Syrian Army, then rebranded as the Syrian National Army, and the other 31 flavors of jihad and Islamism. That one by one, the West and the Gulf states had dropped, right? They had dropped out of the conflict after Russia intervened. The U.S. dropped the Islamists and switched to the Kurds under the Trump administration, right? So first of all, that left out 1/3 of the conflict, right? Because it had devolved into a three-way Mexican standoff between the Syrian government, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, having the majority of the country and the population. The Turks and their jihadist and Islamist allies and proxies camped out all along all 30 kilometers deep inside northern Syria and in the northern part of Idlib province. And then the United States and their Kurdish proxies and former ISIS tribes, former Arab tribes in the east that had sworn fealty to ISIS and then abandoned it. They were camped out in Syria's east, sitting on Syria's oil and wheat fields. So that three-way Mexican standoff, two sides didn't resolve their differences, but agreed to freeze them. And this left the jihadists of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is simply rebranded Al-Qaeda, in control of northern Idlib as kind of a mini caliphate, where they received the, I want to say, largely indirect support of the Turks, right? The Turks would transfer weapons and supplies and money to their direct proxies in the Syrian National Army, and then the Syrian National Army would just hand it over to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as part of deals, and that was known. All right, there was no question that this was happening. There was no question that Al-Qaeda had Turkish support, but the conflict was frozen. However, there was I would say different, both sides interpreted the documents or the spirit of the documents differently. As far as Russia and Iran were concerned, the Turks were supposed to separate the jihadists, the terrorists, from the legitimate Syrian opposition, quote unquote, and then take care of the jihadists. That's what they were supposed to do, right? Of course, they did none of it. They armed their own proxies directly, and they armed and trained Al-Qaeda, right? There was never any action taken against them. There was a few aborted attempts at joint Russian-Turkish patrols along some highways in the Idlib region. It never worked out, never amounted to everyone. Everyone hated each other. But the conflict lulled into quiet there for nearly 5 years, right? Up until September. And September, we started having warnings or eager announcements from the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, which is a Syrian Islamist propaganda mouthpiece in the United Kingdom. Actually, it's one guy, basically one Syrian propagandist, right? That is quoted again and again and has been quoted in Western media since 2011, as if there's some type of objective authority rather than Islamist propaganda. They announced that the forces in Idlib, right, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, i.e. rebranded Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, then Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They've undergone this rebranding process several times. And there's a number of other jihadis, most of them actually foreign jihadis, that work under or that agreed to kind of a loose fealty to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and were allowed to cohabitate northern Idlib region. Maybe one of the foremost among them, the most infamous, there's lots of them, but one of the foremost among them is the Turkestan Islamic Party, right, which is composed large numbers of Salafist former Chinese Uyghurs and Central Asians, and they're one of the most notorious of the jihadist organizations. But that they were preparing to launch renewed offensives, ignoring or violating the Astana agreements that were supposedly, Turkey doesn't support them, but manages to speak for Tahrir al-Sham, right? And that wink and a nod. Now, Russia and Iran at this time are both preoccupied. Russia is preoccupied, obviously, with a proxy war against all of NATO in Ukraine, and Iran has their eye on Gaza and Hezbollah, in the conflict with Israel. In mid-October, there were enough warning signs about the building up of jihadist forces at this point that relatively quietly, Russia began major airstrikes in Idlib that they had not been conducting for years, right? And we're talking, 50 airstrikes in a week, and then they started major drone attacks and helicopter attacks as well. This was mid-October. As far as we can tell, the Syrian army really did nothing to prepare for this, right? That they didn't build up troops, they didn't build defenses, they didn't conduct any significant offensive strikes or operations of their own. The Iranians say they were aware that this is happening. Now they're saying this, and that they warned, but there's no evidence that they did anything either up until it was, or offered to do anything until it was essentially too late. In mid-November, Al Jazeera ran a piece saying again the same thing, that the rebels Al-Qaeda in Idlib was about to launch a major offensive on the Aleppo area. And then it kicked off on November 27th. And very quickly, amazingly quickly, Aleppo was first approached, surrounded, and taken. And in quick succession, within days after that, the city of Hama fell. Now, what's important about these is in the first phase, or the first Syrian conflict, it's really the same conflict. It was just frozen. So in the before the freeze, all of Aleppo had never fallen to the jihadis, right? Half of it had, but the Syrian army hung on valiantly, right, to the other half, and eventually, with Russian and Iranian and Hezbollah help, managed to take all of Aleppo back and drive then the jihadis up into Idlib, where they signed this fool's deal with Erdogan to freeze the conflict. So Aleppo fell. Hama had never fallen in the first conflict, and it fell in a day, right? A day and a half, maybe. So what it appears has happened is there was very little actual fighting. Very little. Not none, but very little. Most of the Syrian Arab army forces, it appeared, withdrew or threw down their weapons and ran away, or actually defected to the opposition. And what it appears to me is that there was a very intense effort over the last 5 years to infiltrate, infiltrate, co-opt the Syrian military. And it has to be said that it really appears that this Syrian military is not the Syrian military of 5 years ago, that it has undergone a huge a rotation of top officers, or a moving them out. There are reports in the Russian telegram sphere, which I cannot confirm, that most of the top officers who were trained by or worked closely with the Russians were removed. with people supposedly more loyal to the Assad family, right? Or Assad has been prickly about his sovereignty of Syria, and that's understandable. But this has gone on. It appears there was a major attempt to co-opt the Syrian military, right? So we're talking bribery, buying them out, blackmail, whatever works for the specific Syrian army officer, and also local administration, political officials, bureaucrats, clan leaders, because there still is very much a minority ethnic clan area. This happened not only in the Aleppo area, but much wider, right? There's some people who are suggesting that, they just had intentions around Aleppo and then they had so much success. No, they also infiltrated all of these cities, and all the cities, right? All the way down into Damascus and in Daraa in southern Syria, with sleeper cells that also activated and created the sense of chaos, and that they were everywhere and that they were overrunning everything. So as far as I can tell, large portions, perhaps the majority of the Syrian army, their officers, their commanders, their political, whoever, ordered them to just retreat or stand down. And there are videos going around on the net now of Russian military walking through areas that had previously been controlled by the Syrian army. And there are just enormous piles of camouflage military uniforms, weapons, everything that were thrown down. They stripped out of their uniforms and their rankings, and they put on civilian clothes. And to do this in such large numbers, right? This isn't a spontaneous thing of people in trenches, right? This is in their own bases and everything. They were ordered to do this by their commanding officers. So now there are Syrian forces that fought outnumbered and bravely, like the Tiger forces, right? Yeah. The Syrian special military forces. But it wasn't enough. And Russian air support, while intense in the beginning, you can only do so much if the Syrian army is not there to fight on the ground, right? Russia's contingent in Syria was down to some 400 people, right? That's it. And the Russian Air Force was working 24/7, right? While before this and while it was going on, once it kicked off. The other thing is that while there are large numbers of these, jihadis, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the new Syrian, or the Syrian National Army directly administered by the Turks, also then moved in, and the rebels in the south and the Daraa area rose up again. Well, large numbers of them are still, crazy jihadis riding around in pickup trucks with machine guns, right? But there was a vanguard force that obviously had, I'm not sure whether it was Turkish military training or Western military training, but they had night vision goggles. They had drones and electronic warfare jamming that they knew how to use, that possibly could have come from the Kiev regime. We know they were bragging that they had been providing this. I'm not sure whether they had advanced training. They knew what they were doing. They had superior equipment. They had howitzers, self-propelled howitzers. They had tanks, right? This is a trained Al-Qaeda with tanks and howitzers and air defense and electronic warfare and drones. And where the Syrian army did fight, like the Tiger forces, they had obviously not been updated with the military practices, particularly with drone use, that has evolved over the last 5 years, that any country that is not keeping on top of is falling behind. Now, I think that the drone use of the jihadis can be overstated, right? But they were definitely doing it. But I think the majority of the element, why it fell so fast, is co-option. And there's actually a long history of this if you look at conflicts that the U.S. has been involved in. Whether this was all Turkish intelligence, I don't know. I doubt that. I think that the CIA and MI6 and Mossad were all probably thoroughly involved in this effort, because it must have been massive. In Iraq in 2003, there was actually very little fighting, right? Most of the Iraqi army was co-opted and bought out. Their families moved out of the country, promises made of money and whatever. The regime is going to fall, save yourself and your family, or we've got pictures of that woman you're sleeping with. Do you want your wife to see them? Whatever it takes, on an individual basis. But that was done on a massive scale in Iraq. And that resulted that Iraq, what had been a very large army at the time,
Right.
very little of it actually fought. It also happened in Libya at the end, not in the very beginning, but at the end in Tripoli, where the commander of the defense of Tripoli just opened the gates and ordered his forces to stand down, which, of course, ultimately led to the raping death of Gaddafi. So there's a history. This works. This works very well when there is cracks, when there is fissures, when there is doubt in the government. And it didn't work. This was attempted back when this conflict first kicked off in 2011, but it didn't work. But what has happened in particular over the last 5 years is the Syrian economy has been absolutely hollowed out. Mm-hmm. I mean, to an extent that it's really hard for us to wrap our heads around. The sanctions, the Western sanctions, crippled them, cut them off from economic finance, and the U.S. camped out on Syria's oil fields and wheat fields, preventing those resources from either making the country money or even supplying. Syria, an oil producer, the government had to import oil, wow. Right? And a Syrian army officer was making about $30 a month. There was power in Aleppo 4 hours a day. Wow. There was problems with water. There was rationing of food, right? There was no hope for a better life. And under those conditions, when you've got being contacted by foreign agents and intelligence offering, hey, it's all going to end. You and your family can be saved from this. You can have a guaranteed income. All you have to do is not fight and die for a regime that and it has to be said that there was corruption in Damascus, like most countries, right? But there was an Alawite elite around Assad that lived in an extravagant lifestyle. Yeah, there's no question about it, and that never ended. In fact, it probably got worse in the last 5 years. And the majority of the Syrian population are Sunnis, 60-some%, right? Now, then there's the Alawites and the Shia and the Druze and the Kurds and all the other minorities. And the Christians, of course, can't forget them. And Assad was seen as the protector of them. But what kind of protector, can't keep the lights on, people can't get gas to fill their gas tanks, and their children have to be rationed and so forth. So this economic hollowing out set the conditions for this. It was very intentional. The U.S. officials were very clear that what they were doing, that they helped to force regime change by sanctions, and they needed that extra push of this covert operation, and then the jihadi horde descending. And there was also military conditions. When Israel invaded southern Lebanon, Hezbollah moved all their forces out of the country, a lot of them around the Aleppo area, to go back to fight for home in Lebanon. So Hezbollah was off the field. The Russian contingent was very small, and they were doing what they could beforehand with the resources they had, but they began, I think, to probably get more and more dismayed as there was no signs that the Syrian army was really doing anything in a major way. And at the end, the Iranians offered to send troops and the popular mobilization units, but they never actually arrived in the country because it all happened so fast. And in the last day or so, they literally stopped at the border. And it has to be said that the U.S. had begun strafing the Iraqi popular mobilization units, the Shia, as they were coming into eastern Syria with A-10 Warthogs, gunships, and drones, effectively operating as the Air Force for Al-Qaeda. Yeah, wow. They said they were doing it out of self-defense.
Well, they even came out and said, well, this has nothing to do with the battlefield. And it's like, okay, get out of here with that nonsense. I'm curious on the Doha talks. And Lavrov had a conversation with Al Jazeera, apparently after those talks. He was not necessarily in the best of spirits. What came out of those conversations? I would imagine that had to be a maddening.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it was something along the line like, "What are you doing? We're winning."
Yeah,
you thought we lost, right? There was a moment back when the Astana agreements were finalized and the conflict was frozen, where Erdogan had to go to Moscow, right, to speak to Putin. He was essentially, he had to go, and he was kept waiting outside of the meeting room, in a waiting room in the Kremlin that was carefully decorated with historical pieces of art showing the defeats of the Ottoman Empire by the Romanov Russian Empire. I'm going to tell you that there are analysts out there who are saying that what Assad needed to do was appease Erdogan more. He needed to meet with him. No. Erdogan is a treacherous and cunning beast. And I'm going to tell you that right when he was forced into this humiliating freezing of the conflict, where his jihadi proxies were on the back step and so forth, he set it on revenge then, right? What Assad wanted was officiation of his control of northern Syria. He wanted that official. Maybe it would still on paper be part of Syria, but he wanted it given broad autonomy as a Sunni Islamist region that he could that would ultimately owe his fealty to him. That he had already purged most of the Kurds out of that area, and there was a political problem he had, right? Other than he had to keep 100,000 jihadis essentially on the paycheck, right? Because that's how big, he was there, how many there were between the Syrian National Army and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But there was several million refugees, Syrian refugees, many of them families and Sunni Islamists who had fled the civil war and who didn't, they were Sunni Islamists, right? By and large, they didn't want to live under the Syrian government. They wanted to live in a Sunni Islamist state, so they were a continual drain on the Turkish economy. And the one thing that all the political factions in Turkey agreed on was they hated these refugees. They wanted them gone. They were sucking up money. They were driving down wages, taking low wages jobs. They were involved in crime networks and so forth. It was a continual political thorn in Erdogan's, re-election ability. So he wanted to transport all of them back to northern Syria and settle them there and essentially become an autonomous region of Syria that he controlled, right, with populated almost exclusively by Sunni Islamists. And Assad would, and I say Assad, but I'm sure very much that, Assad is not a fiat dictator. He has to manage Syria's political elites. And the Syrian political elites would have nothing. They regarded Erdogan as a betrayer, as a backstabber, as someone who was literally, arming and equipping, head chopping, suicide bombing jihadis to kill them and their families, right? They couldn't agree to this. They couldn't agree to give up effective sovereignty to Erdogan over this part of Syria. They thought they could wait him out, and that they had Russia and Iran's support, and that would protect them. Well, it wasn't enough in the end. Erdogan was cunning. He arranged this. I'm sure the U.S. was whispering in his ear and encouraging him on this, and providing some intelligence and other assistance. But that itself, we're going to see, because if you think it's all over, I very much doubt that. First of all of these jihadi groups have been at each other's throats all the time in Idlib, and between those in Idlib and the Syria National Army Turkish occupied area. Also, you have to remember there's the third player in all of this. There's the Kurdish proxies with the U.S. occupation in East Syria.
Right.
Now, obviously, Erdogan hates the Kurds more than anything else, right? He considers them all terrorists, right? And even a U.S. general admitted that the SDF is simply the YPG rebranded for all intents and purposes. So these jihadis now have already started to move east to Manbij, right? And supposedly, in the last 24, there are Turkish reports, that they have control of Manbij already. And I very much doubt they're stopping there. The jihadi Telegram channels are already talking about the upcoming siege to go all the way to Raqqa, right, which is occupied by the U.S.-backed Kurds now. Yeah. So right now, the U.S. is trying to stop, or trying to talk to Erdogan and getting him to put his jihadis back on the leash. But why should he, right? As far as he's concerned, the U.S. for the last 6-7 years has been supporting terrorists against him. Right. The fact that he's supporting Al-Qaeda against Syria, notwithstanding, everyone's definitions of terrorists are different. My definition of terrorists, the Syrian government's definition of terrorists, Al-Qaeda. Erdogan, he's pragmatic, he's an opportunist, but he is also a political Islamist. That's his family, his background, his political party. He sees Al-Qaeda as brothers, right? As political, religious brothers. Meanwhile, he sees the Kurds as the terrorists. So in all of these nonsense Astana agreements, right, they're talking about terrorists, and they're talking about completely different people, right? And that was the fiction of the Astana agreements. And there's lots of blame to go around. There's corruption, there's weakness of Assad, but I place a great deal of responsibility on the Kremlin, on the Iranian government, forever agreeing to this freeze of the conflict, to let a jihadi army sit out in northern Idlib and regather their strength, and to ever trust Erdogan, right? I agree with not going to direct war with Turkey, right? To manage, that the economic costs, the geopolitical costs would be one high. But you deal with him like a snake, and you keep the boot on the snake. Erdogan respects strength, but nothing else. That's the way that I think that you have to deal with him. Now, all of this has huge geopolitical repercussions.
Wait, Russia, the geopolitical implications, the Doha agreements, it was that
nothing
in those agreements that. Well, I was going to ask you the military bases, because Russia got assurances that nothing would take place with the military bases. Were those, you don't buy it?
I mean, maybe that was agreed to at the time when, effectively Lavrov and the Iranian foreign minister come begging to the Turkish foreign minister, right? Because he had all the cards, all the leverage at that point. But do you think for 1 second that's going to last? I don't. I don't even think in the medium term that Russia wants to have military bases in a country that, they said it's too early to talk about it, to make decisions. But Russia doesn't do Salafist jihadis. They don't like them, right? They've got enough problems with them alone. And among their ranks are hundreds, if not thousands, of jihadists, of Salafists from southern Russia, from Chechnya, from Ingushetia in Dagestan, from Central Asia, particularly in the Turkestan Islamic Party, but in others, right? And now they could have a whole country to play and train in and re-export their jihad back to southern Russia and Central Asia. This is why Russia got involved in Syria in the first place. And now, I mean, look at this. Russia has lost, you know, for years now, people were talking that Russia's back in the Middle East in a big way, and all the Gulf states respecting strength and loyalty, you know, started to have good relations with Russia and curry favor with Putin and everything. That's all gone now, right? People don't have respect for a loser, someone who lost in such a dramatic way. And Russia's losing their military bases. They're losing, you know, what was considered, wasn't really, but a Russian proxy state. And it was taken away just like that in this embarrassing shock. Iran as well. It's hard to see how the axis of resistance isn't crippled.
And Iran is well, let's get into the geopolitical implications. What does this mean for Russia? What does this mean for Iran? Wesley Clark had pointed out that they were going to go through all of these states. Syria, Iran was next after Syria. So give me your take. What does this mean geopolitically for Russia now that they've lost this kind of state in the Middle East? What does it mean for Iran?
Yeah, it means Russia has lost their influence in the Middle East, and they're very unlikely to get involved again in the Middle East or anywhere outside their immediate near abroad again in the foreseeable future. Because there's lots of people saying, what did we waste all of this money and lives and everything for during those years where we, you know, saved the Syrian state and then it collapsed overnight on us? And they didn't, as far as anyone can tell, really even fight to save it. So, I mean, that's a huge blow. I mean, Russia's obviously going to double down and focus on Ukraine. But even in Ukraine, now all the Western leaders are going to be saying to themselves, look how weak Russia is. It's all a Potemkin village, right?
Trump has
all of
said
that Russia has in Ukraine can be gone just as quickly. All we have to do is stay the course, right? That is what they'll be saying to them.
Trump has already said it. Trump has said Russia's lost 600,000 people in Ukraine. Look how weak they were. They couldn't defend the Syrian government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's Kiev regime propaganda. Iran, the axis of resistance, which is Iran's influence throughout the Middle East, is going to be crippled now. How do you re-equip and arm Hezbollah with Syria now controlled by Salafists, right? How does that? It becomes, it's not impossible, right? But it will be done on a much smaller scale. Hezbollah will not be a force that Israel has to fear anymore. In fact, Lebanon could be under siege as well next, right? This could activate Sunni forces in Lebanon to act against Hezbollah, right, with Israeli support. The big winners here are Turkey, first and foremost, right? The Neo-Ottoman Empire is in full bloom, right? He's won in Azerbaijan and Armenia. He's at least come to a draw against Russia in Libya, and now this huge victory. I mean, the Arab states are going to be very cautious. They don't want Turkey to have this much power in the Middle East. That's why I think they in part switched back to Russia as balancing out too much Turkish influence in the Middle East. But that's gone now. So he's back in the Middle East as an Ottoman sultan in a major way. Israel benefits hugely from this. Hezbollah is now crippled and Gaza is completely at their mercy. For anyone who thinks that Al-Qaeda is going to suddenly come to the rescue of the Palestinians now, you are a fool. When has Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any of these Salafist groups ever done anything against Israel? Never, right? In fact, there were statements out of of Jolani's circle, right? The leader of Al-Qaeda, who, by the way, was formerly the deputy leader of ISIS. He is now the leader of Al-Qaeda, rebranded. He's on an FBI wanted list, and he's recognized by both the U.S. And the UN as a terrorist, right? As a wanted terrorist leading a terrorist organization. But now he suddenly woke Al-Qaeda, right? The diversity-friendly jihadi. Yeah, that's him. $10 million reward from the State Department. So now that the U.S. is going to do what they have previously done with the Mujahideen Calc, with the Kosovo Liberation Army, with Azov, right? They're going to delist, detoxify people they have previously recognized as terrorists and extremists, because now it's geopolitically convenient for them to do so.
What are you expecting from this? I mean, when in Libya, Iraq, when this happened, those governments utterly collapsed. And,
Yeah.
you know, I guess my expectation is the same in this situation, but what is yours going forward?
So first of all, the big thing will be, can the U.S. manage? Can the U.S. get Erdogan to put the leash back on the jihadis, or will the new civil war in Syria be against the Salafists against the Kurds fighting alone, right? And I no longer have any sympathy for the Kurds after years of being U.S. proxies. I might have at one point, but not anymore. And if they kill each other, I have lack of concern at this point, right? We're out of the game. Russia lost, right? Russia's out of this for all intents and purposes. They'll see what happens, right? They're pragmatic. They'll take their losses on the chin and bear it. But trusting Erdogan ever was, I'm sorry, a huge mistake, and it has cost. And after that, there'll be the question of internal civil war between the various jihadist and Islamist factions that it's very questionable whether Turkey and the U.S., the West, will be able to manage their differences through their respective groups in Syria. So Syria could be looking at decades of civil war, and we have to be careful that this doesn't extend into Lebanon and Iraq, because it's very possible that it could. This could reactivate Sunni extremist forces in Iraq. It could launch attacks against Hezbollah and the Christian population in Lebanon. Israel has already occupied the entirety of the Golan Heights now, and Mount Hebron in southern. Do you think anyone's going to move against them? No, of course not. So now the major player has been taken off the board, and now it's about Turkey and the Salafists, which are for years now firmly left under Turkish control, and the U.S. has their proxy Kurdish and SDF forces. And can they manage their differences? How involved was the U.S. in what actually happened? Was it only incidental, or were they the driving force and everything has already been settled? We don't know. But both Russia and Iran are the big losers. I mean, other obviously than Syria and the Syrian people. This discussion in the Western media. Oh, the Syrian people are not. Which Syrian people are you talking about? Not the Christians, not the Alawites, not the Sharia, not the Druze, not Okay, so the Sunni Islamists are happy, and again, not all Sunni in Syria are Islamists. That's still a minority. That's not. I'm not anti-Sunni. I'm anti-Sunni Islamist and Salafist, right?
Why would? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, they're the biggest victims, right? Other Muslims, whether Sunni or Shia, are the biggest victims of the Islamists and the jihadists, because they are the ones targeted, as apostates, right? To their puritanical, twisted reading of Islam.
Why would Erdogan stop? I mean, the Kurds are considered terrorists by Erdogan. Why would he stop his, his jihadists from taking all of Syria at that point? I mean, wouldn't that
Yeah.
give him more control over the entirety of Syria in general?
Okay, so I mean, there would of course be a cost involved, right? He has to keep these forces supplied and so forth. And I think at some point, if he stays sober, he will understand the possibility of overreach. But now it will be a game of what can you offer me? What can you offer me? Right? Because that's what it's always about with Erdogan, right? He is he's cunning in that way. I despise the man, but to geopolitically underestimate his type of cunning and looking out for himself and playing the U.S. off of Russia and the Islamic world off the West and so forth. I mean, he's done it very skillfully for a couple of decades now, and he will continue to do it up until he fails. And then I imagine his end will be rather quick and dramatic. But he has the leverage now, and everyone's going to be coming and paying court to Erdogan, right? If you want to save some of the Kurds, you go to him, right? If you whoever wants in Syria now, he is holding more cards than anyone else for sure. And can he keep Giuliani, woke Al-Qaeda now as he's being can he? He's like, oh, that was a phase of my life when I was deputy leader of the brutality of ISIS. And yes, I was the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, but I've moved on. That was a phase of my life. Like I was a goth teenage girl once, and I got over that phase of my life. That's the way the Western media and all of the 50,000 or so jihadis under him, they also had Damascene conversions, and now they're woke. I saw the CNN interview of him, and they had his name, and then they had his pronouns. Him. It's that bordering between obscene and absurd that is.
But they're trying to sanitize the terrorists. I mean, the idea that, I went through a phase of chopping off heads, but I've changed now. It's like, okay, sure you have. The
Western mainstream media is the most vile, obscene bunch of whitewashers and apologists, and it's just coming to a crux now. Before, there was the pretense of a Syrian National Council or everything. Now it's just whitewashing the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, a former ISIS leader himself, right? It's because there's no challenge to it. There's no criticality. There's no anything.
What does this mean for Iran? By the way, I mean, Israel is creating its greater Israel. Hezbollah has been decapitated. Netanyahu has already come out claiming credit for all of this. Like I said,
Trump has already said that he is going to destroy Iran with sanctions, right? That he's going to revert to an economic war. But now lots of people are going to be whispering in his ear, look how easy Assad's government fell. We could do the same thing to Iran. Because there's no question that Assad has thoroughly infiltrated Iran, right? They're able to assassinate people and do sabotage and terror attacks with complete impunity in Iran on a major basis. They are not quite, but almost as vulnerable to co-option and subversion, right? As Syria was. Everyone's going to be saying now Iran is next, and they're going to be saying, look, we rewrote the region already. We can go one step further and put a new Shah back in or whatever it takes. Those will be lots of those neocons. They're very much anti-Iranian and pro-Israeli, and they're going to be whispering that in Trump's ears. So they could encourage him to go from economic warfare to covert warfare, to direct warfare, whatever it takes to get rid of Iran. Iran is in the targets now.
I mean, Iran was in the target going back to 2007 under the Bush administration. I mean,
but now they've lost their strategic depth and influence. in the region, right? Now their biggest ally is gone. They're now at a further logistical and support remove from the entire axis of resistance. And the axis of resistance was already starting to have its doubts about Iran because Pezeshkian has been so weak, so timid in responses. So I'm would be very shocked now. I'm not saying the axis of resistance is gone, but it's going to be crippled. And it's probably going to start to fade away. And this is also shocking because just a few months ago, the axis of resistance seemed so strong, right? Just a half a year ago. And now,
Mark, 2 more questions before I let you go.
Like building a foundation in sand.
Yeah, just faded away. Russia is coming up with a security partnership with Iran. What does it mean now?
We don't even, is that going to happen now?
Well, that was kind of what I'm getting at. What does it mean now in this context?
Yeah, I don't know what it means. I don't, because I don't know what's in it. I very much is supposedly a deep and strengthened relationship. I'm sure intelligence sharing, C4 ISR, military technical joint building of some systems, that sort of thing. But I mean, I very much doubted that it included a mutual defense clause like with North Korea. But I mean, I also would have said the same thing about the mutual defense clause with North Korea, that it wasn't going to happen. But now everything has got to be called into question, right? Both Russia and Iran, they're going to a certain extent probably going to be blaming each other, right? There's going to be soul searching, recrimination, examination. I would not be surprised at all if this strategic partnership signing gets delayed and possibly even disappears. Yeah. Now, there's already a strategic partnership between Russia and Iran, right? This was supposed to be a deeper, more comprehensive one.
What could they have done differently? Be it Assad, Putin, meaning, was this a fait accompli? Was there anything differently that they could have done in order to stave this off or stop it in its entirety?
So, I mean, that's armchair quarterbacking, of course, but myself, I think the Astana agreements were as flawed as the Minsk agreements were, right? It was Putin's tendency to always reach for diplomatic solutions. And in an ideal world, that is admirable, right? But you almost wouldn't expect it from the caricatured vision of a Russian leader. But Putin is very legalistic. He's very cautious. But I think both were a mistake. I think that you have to deal with the Kiev regime and with Erdogan from a position of strength, and you don't take your eye off the ball. You don't take your boot off the snake, right? They never should have let Idlib breed another generation. Remember, so it's been 5 years, right, of Al-Qaeda control of Idlib. Children that were 14 and 15
19
are now fighters, right? They were raised, right? And the same thing is happening in Ukraine. When Azov goes into schools and gives their Banderite fascist ideological indoctrination to Ukrainian children, turning them into, the next generation of anti-Russian warriors, right? That it's should be a huge recognition of Russia, of how dangerous that was and this was, right? But of course, Russia does have limits to what they can do with their hard power. Now, though, their army is much bigger, much stronger, much more experienced than it ever was before. I simply hope that they learn the right lessons from what has happened in Syria, and they don't attempt some ceasefire or freezing of the conflict or similar deal with Trump in Ukraine that will simply see the Kiev regime regrown only to have the conflict launched again. You don't stop. You dictate terms from strength on the battlefield, because unfortunately, that is the brutal, realist world we live in, and you don't give your enemies mercy. You don't give them anything, deal with them, yes, when you have them thoroughly defeated and they don't have the opportunity to rise again. That is the time for mercy, not before that.
Mark Sleboda, international relations and security analyst. Mark, deeply appreciate your explanation, man. Like I said, this was utterly shocking to me that they collapsed this fast.
Me too. I took my eye off the ball in Syria, and I had no idea that the Syrian army and the Syrian government had rotted and deteriorated that much and been co-opted ultimately, right? I'm as guilty of not keeping my eye on that ball as anyone else. Although I will say that I was against the Astana agreements when they were signed back in 2000, just as I was against the Minsk Accords when they were signed back then. That I will say that I was against.
You're proven right on both. I mean, these agreements were used as just cudgels, time to build up militaries. They weren't, taken as earnest terms, the way that I think Russia went into the belief that they were going to be. So, but Mark Sleboda, international relations and security analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1. You can find him on YouTube on his channel, Real Politic with Mark Sleboda. Check that channel out. If you like his analysis here, you're going to love his channel. You can also find him on Facebook.com/Gramsci. Thank you for this, Mark. I really do appreciate it, man.
Thanks for having me.
All right. That was a fantastic rundown by Mark Sleboda on what was taking place in Syria. Like I said, I was utterly shocked about what was taking place. I assumed going by 2011 and how hard Assad fought, like grim death to stay in power, that something similar would happen this time, that it may take time for Hezbollah or for the matter of the Russians to get more involved in the conflict while the Syrian army holds them off. That is not what happened. That is decisively not what happened. As Mark pointed out, it just evaporated. And the agreements, just like the Minsk agreements, that were meant to solidify a deal in order to put down an issue, became kind of a template by which they could gain time, build forces, and then invade in a brutal way that was able to effectively take over the Syrian government. The question that remains more than anything else now at this point is, now what? If you think of Iraq and if you think of Libya, those countries turned into basket cases of civil war pretty quickly. What now? What happens in Syria? There are a lot of religious groups, minorities, that are terrified at this moment, not knowing what is going to happen to them and whether or not Jelani, who's a diversity-friendly, a gay-friendly, diversity-friendly terrorist, is going to revert back to the head-chopping ways and putting people in cages and setting them on fire, and enact Sharia law over top of the entirety of the population, where they're either going to be killed or expelled. It is an open question in real terms. Many of the people that I had the conversation to talk with that are in Syria, that are currently in Syria. In fact, there's some people who told me that they would not even come on the show because they're concerned that their family members will get killed if indeed they're seen on a network like this being critical of that government. That is where we are. There's a lot of people who are chest stomping this in the West who are saying this is a great day for Syria, and who say freedom and democracy will reign in Syria. Mind you, they're saying freedom and democracy with a guy that is literally on the terrorist watch list for A, being prolific at killing Americans and other Muslims, and B, who, for all intents and purposes, were part of groups that we were fighting just years ago. I mean, I could show you the tweets where Donald Trump pointed out the same people who were flying planes in the buildings were effectively the same people trying to overthrow the Syrian government. This is the stuff that Donald Trump was saying beforehand. When Donald Trump ended Obama's regime change war, his billion-dollar program, dump money, weapons, and everything else in Syria, Trump ended that program, and as Mark kind of pointed out, started working with the Kurdish forces in order to steal the oil. So there was that. Donald Trump had pointed out we shouldn't get involved in this. We shouldn't have anything to do with it. We were already involved. Like the idea that you're saying we shouldn't have gotten involved in this or we shouldn't be involved in this is utter nonsense. The U.S. has been involved in creating this kind of sectarian divisions going all the way back to the Bush administration. Seymour Hersh's article, Redirection, in the New Yorker, the redirection, in the New Yorker, points it out very plainly that the U.S. started to target Iran, and in trying to target Iran, started looking at Syria as the weak link. Right here, for example, administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure the priorities of the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shiite organization that is backed by Iran. The United States has taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria, a byproduct of the activities that has been bolstering of Sunni extremist groups in response to militant vision of Islam that are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. Think about that. And people are chest thumping as if this is a great day, as if this is a good thing. It's not necessarily that Assad is a great guy. It's not that. It has nothing really to do with Assad, at least in my vision of it, or the way I'm thinking of it. It has to do with what is going to take place to the people on the ground now. What is the condition of the Syrians themselves? And there was a reason that many of those Syrians were utterly and entirely terrified of the terrorists taking over, because they remember that these were the same people that were chopping off heads, that were putting people in cages and setting them on fire, and they were executing Muslims of faiths that they don't necessarily consider to be legitimate. These are the people who we backed to get into this particular position. Israel attacked Syria immediately, and not just the Golan Heights, also Damascus, meaning Israel took the opportunity to blow up any notion of strength in Syria, in Damascus, and in other regions. This was one of the fires that broke out in Damascus after Israel bombed Damascus. This was after Jelani took over. And this was after. It's a dark day for the people of Syria. And like I said, I have a certain amount of melancholy associated with all of this. I guess my feeling is, and maybe the melancholy is coming from the speed at which it happened, the inability of Russia, or for that matter, Iran, to help, the reluctance of the Syrian military to even fire a shot in anger. And I do know that there are some groups in Syria that did fight, fair enough. I even watched one guy get beheaded, which wasn't necessarily the best thing in the world to watch. But nevertheless, all things being equal, I saw the videos of Russians coming up to uniforms and guns, just laying on the ground, with reports of Syrians and fighters going to Iraq. So whether they were paid off, like I said, whether they were blackmail, whatever that situation was, this is not necessarily the greatest of days. And I would go further. You know, we've done this before. When we worked with the Mujahideen in order to get the Russians in Afghanistan, who eventually became Al-Qaeda, who eventually flew planes into our building. Like, we've done this before. We're doing this again, as if we haven't necessarily learned the lessons of history associated with this. I want to bring in my next guest. I am joined, one second. There we are. Let me bring you in. There you are. I'm joined with Piers Robinson. He's co-director of the Organization of Propaganda Studies. And welcome to the show, man. How you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing well. Good to see you, Jamal.
Oh, good to see you, man. The reason why I asked you on is because propaganda studies is a really good subject for today. And it goes on so many levels in regards to the Syrian conflict, the civil war, the way we're doing now, where we're having these interviews where they're doing these softball interviews of Jelani, like he's just a regular guy. He's just, he just went through a phase of chopping off heads. That's all. That's all it was. He's reformed now. So he's diversity-friendly terrorist that is now taken over. He's going to be patient and tolerant of the local population of minorities. It's just astonishing to me the way they flip on a dime. The man has a $10 million bounty by the U.S. government. It's not like the U.S. government didn't know where he was as he was taking over Syria. They effectively allowed it and then gave this kind of softball interview in order to moderate his appearance. Give me a take on this. And let me start off at the beginning of it, first and foremost. Your take on everything that's happened over the last 2 weeks and the speed and rapidity at which has happened.
Well, I think the situation now in Syria needs to be placed into a slightly broader contemporary historical context. Okay. We know very well now that regime change wars were being planned prior to 9/11, immediately after 9/11. And I mean, I work now for the International Center for 9/11 Justice, and my opinion as an academic is that the evidence is very clear that that was a manufactured war trigger or a false flag event in order to start major wars in the international system. And we knew
we totally disagree with that, but go ahead.
Sure, that's fine. That you're completely entitled to your opinion.
Yeah.
What we know from the Chilcot Report documents, which was the British inquiry into the Iraq War in 2003, we know that Tony Blair and George Bush were discussing multiple regime change wars within weeks of 9/11. We know that insiders have spoken about planning prior to 9/11. Wesley Clark famously in 2006 said that the goal was 7 countries in 5 years. Syria and Iran were on that list. And obviously, the kickoff wars at the beginning of the global war on terror was Afghanistan and Iraq. They obviously used deception, particularly in the case of Iraq, claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, creating a link supposedly with the alleged allegations against Al-Qaeda and 9/11 in order to enable that war, that invasion. Segue through to the Arab Spring, as in inverted commas, as it's described. You then had the successful overthrow of the Libyan government. And then in 2011, you had the start of what's, I think, accurately characterized as the dirty war in Syria, which was a covert attempt to overthrow the Syrian government. And it's quite well known now, Operation Timber Sycamore, which was a joint CIA-Saudi operation, fueling extremist groups, Salafist extremist groups, linked to Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, etc., all for the purposes of trying to overthrow the Syrian government. And what we have in the last week, 2 weeks, really, is the endpoint that the achievement of those plans, which have been in place for well over 20 years in order to overthrow the Syrian government, after years of bloodshed in the country, huge loss of life. And most of this, and this gets to your point about propaganda, most of this has been primarily sold to Western publics, or in other words, the propaganda campaign underpinning it has involved systematic attempts to demonize the Syrian government, demonize Assad, to whitewash the groups that we're supporting, as you just described, in relation to Jelani and HTS, who've effectively taken over at the moment in Syria, making them appear to be democratic, desiring, tolerant groups, maintaining the narrative that the Assad government is guilty of torture and guilty, of course, of using chemical weapons against its own population. And certainly from my own research, which I've been involved in, and I've obviously been involved in the OPCW, which is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the controversy over one of those alleged attacks in Duma in 2018, where ultimately two of the inspectors involved with that investigation basically blew the whistle that it was being manipulated in order to point the finger at the Syrian government. So, and I've studied other of these alleged events in Syria, Ghouta 2013, for example, and the evidence is very clear that these are false flags, or they are, in other words, staged events. Not to say that people aren't being killed, because certainly in the case of Duma, people were killed, but it's not because the Syrian government was carrying out chemical weapons attacks on its population. But that narrative has been built and pumped out across Western mainstream media for many, many years. And then again, the representation of the Assad government as a source of pure evil in the country. And that has enabled this to occur. And again, going back to the point about the regime change wars, we know who was behind the regime change wars. Project for a New American Century, neoconservative blocs within the US. One might broaden that out to the American national security state or the deep state driving these wars as a matter of maintaining Western power in the international system. That was the goal of these wars. And that's exactly what we see playing out now. These wars are geopolitical wars fought, driven by the Western war machine, if you want to call it that, in the context where the international system is changing rapidly. China, Russia, India, BRICS, the global south. And this is a militaristic roll of the dice by the West, which unfortunately now has just carried on and on. People such as myself realized back in 2003 that the Iraq war was some kind of a deception. I subsequently established it was a deception over WMD. Syria, from my own research, looking at the propaganda associated with Syria, have come to understand that that's a deception as well. All of these conflicts have been driven through deceptive propaganda. And the goal is to strengthen Western geopolitical interests in the Middle East.
Piers,
And
just to back you up real quick, I want to back up something that you said.
Sure.
So the Syrian chemical weapons, the OPCW thing was a really big deal, because I think that set the consciousness of America on this notion that Assad is a brutal dictator that is gassing his own people. And one of the things that Seymour Hersh pointed out in his piece, they wouldn't even publish it here in the United States. They published it, I believe, in the London Book Review. And it pointed out that this more likely than not came through Turkey, not Syria. It wasn't even the same kind of product that was used. Like the sarin gas that was being moved through was coming through Turkey, wasn't necessarily a product from Syria itself, which called into question whether or not Syria was responsible at all. The OPCW report pointed out that they had to change the report. And I'll let you go into that part. This notion that the OPCW comes out with an initial report, and then come to find out some of the scientists who were there said that they were pushed, they were forced, or either the report was taken from them and changed of various people who weren't on the ground in order to even make that assessment. Give me your take on that, on what went on with that. Explain that to the American public, because that was a big deal. That was one of the big ticket items in the public consciousness.
Sure. The example you put up there was the Ghouta 2013 attack. Which was surrounding the infamous Obama administration's red line. If Assad crosses this red line, we will intervene, etc. That's a separate controversy from the OPCW in relation to Duma in 2018.
Oh, that's right. That was chlorine. But
both, I mean, both are connected. I mean, there are some very interesting things to say about Ghouta in 2013, and the most interesting one in terms of work that I've been doing and also engaging with the author of the UN investigation, A.K. Selstrom, is the fact that there's a measurement error on one of the rocket trajectories, and it's a measurement error. And this is based upon work done by Michael Cobbs and Adam Larson. The measurement error allowed basically the finger to be pointed at the Syrian government. And it's an error. So it's a demonstrable error. They're unable to, AK Selstrom is unable to give a clear response to that. So there was clearly a problem with that finger being pointed at the Syrian government with Gucci 2013. And as you rightly documented there, Seymour Hersh talked about his intelligence was, or his contacts were saying that this looked like it was opposition groups who were obtaining these materials via Turkey. And I think that's part of that story. What happened in Duma in 2018 was initially the Americans said that there was a sarin, a nerve agent attack. And then they started to say, well, it's a chlorine attack, that this large number of civilians have been killed, 43 civilians in a chlorine attack in Duma, in a suburb of Damascus. And what happened is when, to get to the point you raised about the OPCW team, when the inspectors got in on the ground, they did their work, they came back, and they wrote up an initial report. And one of the problems they hit upon straight away was that there was no evidence of the nerve agent was ever found. And they were expecting this because the Americans had claimed this originally. But then this didn't really make a lot of sense because 43 people had died in a building. And you expect a nerve agent to be able to cause people to fall dead on the spot. But you don't expect chlorine gas to cause 43 people just to drop dead on the spot because people run away from chlorine. And what happened was the inspectors went to NATO toxicologists and showed them the witness testimony and the images. And the answer was very clear. These people weren't killed by chlorine. And that information was in the original report. And it was essentially, it was supposed to be published. And then at the last minute, without telling the Duma team, the inspectors who went, and without telling the lead inspector who'd written the report, Brendan Whelan, somebody switched a report and removed all of his information and essentially created a spun report which suggested that chlorine gas had been used to all intents and purposes. And that was the start of the controversy, at least internally within the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, that the investigation was being controlled. It was being manipulated in order to get evidence out of the reports which suggest that this might be a staged event, or that there wasn't really solid evidence at all of the attack that was being claimed. This was all basically pushed out. And then when the final report did come out, two of the most experienced scientists within the OPCW took a stand again, internally at least, and said, look, we need to have a conversation with the Director General. Something has gone terribly wrong with this investigation. And there are multiple problems with this final report which has come out, not least of which the NATO toxicologists who said that these civilians were not killed by chlorine gas is gone, or it hasn't been properly resolved. And they were simply stonewalled. They were blocked. They were not allowed to speak to the Director General. They were shut down. And then subsequent to that, material was leaked by WikiLeaks, which documented what had been going on within the organization. Effectively, the testimony of two of the scientists came out into the public domain. There were UN Security Council meetings. But all the way through, the OPCW refused to allow the inspection team to come back together again in order to, can we just see where this has gone wrong? And of course, the Americans and the Brits and the French were in the background of all of this. And, you know, you've got, for example, when one report was issued by the OPCW, after there'd been a big argument within the team saying, look, you've tried to put out a fabricated report, or essentially a manipulated report. We've caught you and stopped you from doing that. They then had a visit from 3 American officials. They weren't quite clear who they were, State Department, not very clear, who basically ran through a set of slides and PowerPoint bullet points and said, yeah, they were killed by chlorine gas and it was Assad who did it, without providing any sort of clear evidence to the inspectors. But you can imagine the dynamic that created for the OPCW team. You've got 3 officials from a states party, from the US, coming in, telling you what happened. It's clearly going to sort of be a powerful signal to the inspectors that this is the expected result. And this is what America expects from the result. And so that's the story of the Duma alleged attack. And it's effectively, you know, after all of these alleged incidents and all of these investigations, you finally had one where clearly some people within the OPCW thought, well, this is getting beyond the joke, that there is a
Yeah.
clear manipulation going on. We need to try and sort of stand up for the truth and so on. And they had to be stonewalled after that and so on. And I, of course, I work now with Jose Bastani, who's the first Director General of the OPCW, along with Hans von Sponeck and Professor Richard Falk, representing the issues raised by the scientists. But Duma is the entry into, or it's the crack in the dam, which allows you to understand that actually all of these investigations have been manipulated. And when you go back and look at previous alleged attacks, it doesn't take very long to start finding the same problems. They're relying upon the White Helmets, a group which is aligned in the country with Western interests, who are supplying the information about the alleged attack and so on. And this is how the narrative has been built and maintained on pointing the finger at the Syrian government. It's a strategic deception, and it's a strategic deception conducted by Western proxies in the country, working with people who effectively have penetrated the OPCW in order to maintain that narrative. Yeah. Very similar to what we saw in a way with Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction.
Iraq,
manipulation, but here you got manipulation going on in the OPCW, and that's the truth of it. And Ghouta is, when you look closely at Ghouta, the similar problems arise. All of the other alleged attacks. But it requires somebody to actually take the time and look through the reports, and then you can see that they're flawed. But of course, the mainstream media don't. They just take the headlines and then put it out. And
how do they, like, the expectation is that media, because media just reports. That's all they do. A government official said so-and-so, and the media just reports it. And I remember when this first came out, I believe it was Aramate was really hitting on this, basically pointing out, wait a minute, this looks dodgy. This doesn't look like what they say it is. And the media just ignored it. I mean, I remember they had 2 OPCW officials, as you pointed out, that came out vocally saying, this is not the right report. And the media just ignored it. Like, it's amazing to me in the way
and
that
did a little bit more. They also just smeared.
Right.
So this is what happened to Seymour Hersh when he reported on Ghouta in 2013. Yes, that was the end of his access, I understand it, to mainstream US media. He was smeared as a conspiracy theorist or as an Assad apologist. And you get attacked. And that's happened to me. It's happened also to the OPCW inspectors. The media also engages in smearing and attacking you to try and shut you up. This is don't touch this issue because we'll make your life hell. And so it's not just silence, it's also quite active, I think, in terms of trying to suppress the truth.
Do you think that, like, what do you think the connection is? That media has certain government sources that they don't want to lose access to? Do you think they are running with just the government line? Like, the government says this, so this is what we're going with. I mean, the fact that the New York Times has that report, the $1 billion CIA regime change war, basically Obama was trying to overthrow the Syrian government. It was spending like $1 billion to do it. Okay, did the media know that beforehand? When Tulsi Gabbard goes on to CNN and tells Jake Tapper, Jake, we're trying to overthrow the government. Jake, we're paying these people to do this. And Jake Tapper is like, well, the government said they're not doing that. Like, why does he reflexively say that when we can look back in the past and see that the government has overthrown other governments? Like, it's amazing to me that it's like the disconnect is always there. They always know about it 20 years into the future, but in the moment, they always miss it. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I mean, in the field of political communication studies, you know, it's very well documented. And of course, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's propaganda model and then that reflected a wider literature, explained how journalists in mainstream media, partly they're very reliant upon sources, as you say, and official sources, and they defer to those official sources. But there are also essentially corporate interests for mainstream media, and those often overlap with government interests, especially in the context of foreign policy. And that creates a situation where if a journalist is going to go and cover a really controversial issue, they'll start to have quite a hard time. There'll be pushback from the government, and there'll potentially be pushback from their editors, and even then higher up in the corporation. And because that is a hard reality, actually journalists internalize what works and what doesn't work. I think so. I think that kind of propaganda model of the mass media is well established, and it explains a lot of what we see. There's also a lot of people in the in the mass media who are almost undoubtedly connected to the intelligence services. As a church committee in the 70s, identified this quite clearly, the number of CIA-connected journalists there were in the American mainstream media. So you have an element of that going on. I've certainly had some experience of that over time. But these factors all work together to create a situation where journalists are just very unwilling to rock the boat, especially when it comes to foreign policy, and especially when it comes to war. Is another thing, so wars create and crisis situations create a situation where journalists, their patriotism can even kick in. So they don't want to question the Syria attacks, in the alleged counter attacks in Syria, because they'll be accused of being pro-Russian and so on. Just kind of implicating that you're some kind of traitor because you're raising these questions and so on. And all of these forces work together and create a very disciplined group of journalists. And so they don't even think to ask. My sense in recent years, this has just got even worse. I think that, as more and more people have kind of like drifted away from the mainstream media because they don't trust what they're being told, there's almost been this sort of doubling down in the mainstream media. But we have been telling them the truth, and it is the governments who are telling us the truth. And boy, we're going to make sure that we stick to this. And that's what they're doing. And it seems to become even worse. So, I think Sy Hirsch said this, that there was a time when there was some tolerance for dissent. And of course, John Pilger, who passed away last year, the Australian war journalist, said that, he was a regular in the Guardian newspaper up until about 2015. And he said by that point, he was pretty much being frozen out. And so I think these kind of pressures on journalists have become worse and worse. And it's probably because the geopolitical world that we're moving into, the 9/11 and the global war on terror and the conflict now against Russia and the Ukraine, potentially China, potentially war now of Iran, now that Syria has fallen. All of these create a broader environment where journalists, I think, are just very, very scared. Not that justifies what they're doing, because they should be committed to the truth. But you've got a mortgage to pay, you've got kids to feed. And so you're thinking, okay, I'll go for a controversial issue, which is kind of like an acceptable controversy, one that sort of, either Republicans or if not the Democrats are pushing and so on. And I'll get caught up in that controversy and reporting both sides, or maybe take a side. But I won't go outside of that sphere into what Daniel Halland, a political communication theorist, described as a sphere of deviance and question things more fundamentally. And that's what we've got now. And I think the sphere of legitimate controversy, where journalists feel they can say controversial things, is shrunk. And the sphere of deviance is really very, very big. And I think that explains a lot of what we see. And then the final thing is propaganda. Governments engage in a lot of propaganda, and Western governments are very good at it. They put huge resources into it. And so that, I think, is the final sort of layer to this, which if journalists aren't aware that they're being subjected to organized propaganda campaigns, as has been the case in Syria, if they think that the OPCW is telling us the truth, if they think that the white helmets are telling us the truth because they think the white helmets are independent when they're not, then, that's what they think the truth is, and so on. So
that's so wild to me. It's like you can look back into the past and see the lies that governments use in order to get from point A to point B, and yet in the moment, it's never the case. And I agree with you. Do you think that the reason why it's getting more narrow, meaning they seem to be more recalcitrant, more reflexive in regards to going with the government line, is because from the geopolitical standpoint, the West is under pressure? If you're talking about, for example, like the states, what is the word I'm looking for? The multipolarity, for example. From their point of view, well, multipolarity by definition is a direct contrast to a hegemon. We want to be a hegemon. And from the standpoint of the West, they could look like, especially from the standpoint of Western media, to be more aggressive, pushing back against it, especially now that you have social media that kind of diversifies the way that people can consume media. So the moment that something happens abroad, I can see it immediately. whereas beforehand, the only point of view that was given was from mainstream media in and of itself. Do you think this kind of global Cold War, unacknowledged as it is the cause of that? I mean, I'm beginning to think that there's more constraints on the media than we're aware of, just because of the way that they report stories. I mean, the Jelani thing, all of a sudden just came out the blue, that all of a sudden he's a moderate. Like, who gives that order to say, yeah, this guy's now a moderate, go and do that story?
Well, it's the propaganda campaign. We need to package and sell this guy a little bit like Zelensky in Ukraine. Yeah. Package this guy as a moderate, democracy-loving, human rights-loving individual, and so on. We've got to market this person to the Western publics and so on. We've got to demonize the enemy. And that's where that's coming from the propaganda drives, but it's getting worse, as you say, because the geopolitical realities of the world are a huge challenge to the West. The Western Empire, the West has dominated for hundreds of years in the international system. The US has dominated the post-World War II political environment, and that is changing. You see it changing. Obviously, we're effectively almost in a direct war with Russia over Ukraine. Losing that war, of course, people will say, but we've won in Syria now. But as you said a bit earlier on, we've been here before. We've seen what happened in Libya. We've seen what happened in Iraq. We've seen what happened in Afghanistan. And here we are doing the same thing again. But all of this is, the shifts in the distribution of power in the international system, the decline of the West. Now, the Western power centers and the permanent security states are pushing as hard as they possibly can to double down and try to shore up our position, which is my point about the global war on terror and 9/11. This is part of trying to get to this sort of, can we keep the West as the dominant hegemon in the international system? And I think it's a losing, apart from the morality of it, it's a losing battle in the long term. And it's going to lead, obviously, one of the fears that we could lead to a major war in the international system, or it could just lead to a lot of bloodshed, as we're seeing and continue to see, perhaps a war against Iran with more countless lives lost. Yeah. A lot of bloodshed before finally the reality seeps in or sinks into enough people within the Western elite. Because I don't think it's the public so much. The publics don't want war. Most people don't want war and so on. They want to be left to get on with their lives. But it's the war machine, the permanent war machine. If at some point, the reality sinks in that this strategy is bad for us, it's bad for the West, or it can't succeed, then the change might start to emerge, and we'll see an end to this. At the moment, I think, although the Syrian government has been removed now, we have to wait and see how that translates within the region in terms of distribution of power. At the moment, it looks like a shift to the West, and obviously Israel is exploiting it. It's already moved tanks into parts of Syria, but this is not clear how this is going to play out at the moment. In the Ukraine, it's certainly the case that Russia has demonstrated that it can take the territory that it wants to take. The Urashnik missile, it has demonstrated to the West, the hypersonic missile, that there's that military capability which the West has to take seriously, that the West cannot act as the world's hegemon in a world where these military changes have occurred, but also more fundamentally, where the economics of the world are changing. Right. The BRICS, global South, these emerging economies which are hungry for growth and to develop and so on. And they have served our interests for a long time. The Western Empire has done very well. Western imperialism, hundreds of years. But I think that time in the world is coming to an end for these structural reasons I described. But the elites aren't seeing that yet, and they're just pushing as hard as they can, partly because they're at the top of the power structure and they benefit the most from the arms industry and so on. But I think for Western publics, we have a broken financial system. There's a lot of dissent on the streets. There's a lot of dissent here in Germany in relation to Ukraine, for example. And I think, as the wars persist and so on, I think that kind of dissent and disengagement from governments will just grow and grow. So I don't see this going on forever, but it's been going on for a long time, and it can persist for quite some time to come. But I think the writing is on the wall. We have to change path and away from, we've got to be on top of the world, be the dominant player, and actually start to learn to work with other power centers in a more equal way. Sorry.
Not take this hubristic position every time you're dealing with another country that they're going to be offended by. You're in Germany. That's fascinating. I want to come back to the Germany thing for a moment, because Europe is astonishing to me. Like what they're doing to Romania, or for that matter, even what they're doing to Georgia right now, is mind-blowing. And it's almost as if they've gone with this notion that in order to be a democracy, you have to be aligned with the EU or the West broadly. And if you take any dissension from that, then by definition, you're not a democracy. That is an astonishing concept, because what it allows is effectively governments that are sovereign governments can be put under this kind of Maidan 2.0 or 3.0 pressure. They effectively blew off the Romanian election because of TikTok videos that they're saying influence the public. Now, they did that in the way, but in the US also, saying that Russia spent money, or what was it, Internet Research Organization.
Yes, the first Trump. Yeah,
that was a private company just trying to maximize profit, and they're trying to say, well, the $1 billion that Hillary Clinton spent was clearly outweighed by the $50,000 that were spent on ads, half of which took place after the election. It's just outrageous, and they're doing the same thing again. Before I get to that, the other element I would argue, and I want to get your take on, of what is taking place in regards to the diversification of media, using social media, where people can get news and information from other sources that are not necessarily filtered through the way the mainstream media gives it. You also made this other point that the majority of people at this point have started to get very skeptical of the information that media is giving them, hence going to other news sources. Censorship has to be the other side of propaganda. It has to be. Because what they decided, John Kerry came out, said the First Amendment is a problem. We have to do something about it. Hillary Clinton said we need to start locking up people who are saying things that Hillary Clinton don't necessarily like them to say, despite the fact that Hillary Clinton is one of the biggest purveyors of misinformation. Kamala Harris was going to go after Twitter. And even after the election of Donald Trump, what many Democrats heard was, people were getting information from sources that we don't like, so we need to now do something about the fact that they're getting those sources. Whether it's going after TikTok, whether it's going with YouTube and all these companies functioning as basically proxies of the West by withholding certain information that they don't necessarily want to be told. How do you view censorship in this lens in regards to the propaganda model of journalism, or propaganda model of the way governments put out information?
Well, just first, the first point you raised about this indicative of the arrogance of the West, how we try to impose, absolutely, you know, we try to impose ourselves on other countries, and we claim it's for democratic reasons, but it's really for our own interests and so on. But it just gives us a stick to beat countries with, and so on. But the arrogance is incredible. What you see coming out of the mouths of Western politicians and European politicians, von der Leyen, at the EU and so on, is breathtaking, but in a sense not so different from what we've seen for the last 400 years from the West. You know, I'm British by birth, obviously, and you know, the arrogance of the British Empire. We are here to civilize you. You know, the white man's burden and so on. You see this written on statues still for the great imperialists of the 18th, 19th century and so on, civilizing Africa, for example. You know, that's the mindset of the West and so on which still pervades. So I agree entirely with you on that. On this issue of censorship, I mean, yes, we have social media. Governments are very aware that trust in mainstream media is flatlining, largely for extremely good reasons. Iraq, 9/11, you know, the list goes on.
Go down the list. Yeah.
There's so many things you can point to show that the media doesn't tell you the truth. So they know that. A lot of people go to independent social media. And I think the censorship, I think you are right, that censorship is some would argue it's the bigger part of propaganda. Propaganda is a little bit about promoting things. It's mainly about shutting down some areas. And at the moment, because of social media, because of distrust in the mainstream media, they're really having to get tough on the censorship front. So you have these legislation, for example, in Europe, the Digital Services Act, which sort of integrate this fact checking and so on into the legislation. And it's essentially a way of basically filtering out and censoring people's whose opinions that people in power don't like. And they are having to do this at unprecedented levels now in the West. So we have people being prosecuted, as C.J. Hopkins, an American playwright here in Berlin, is being prosecuted for a tweet. In Germany, they're also arresting little people, members of the public, who tweet and offend a politician. And the idea is that if a politician feels that they can't do their job because somebody said something rude about them on Twitter, you can be prosecuted for that.
Oh, that's
and
outrageous.
they're doing it. Which is outrageous. So what they're trying to do is they're using legislation now. They're not just sort of using censorship in terms of trying to keep some stories out of the media. They're actually going for people in independent media who are saying things, and members of the public, and carrying out legal action against them. And they're having to do that because, I guess this gets to my main answer, because their position is weak, because they have lost the trust of so many people. Large swathes of the public. That what can we do now? It's like the Hillary Clinton example you gave. It's, let's lock them up, make it illegal, and so on. It's a sign of weakness, and that they have a certain degree of ability to manipulate the information environment via the internet because of algorithms and bots and so on. But what they can't really control is what people say to each other out on the streets and when they go to the pub or they meet friends and so on. That's a whole communications network they can't get control of. And I think they'd like to believe they can control that space through the internet and so on, and through mainstream media. But I think that's, again, they're on a hiding to nothing, but they are trying as hard as they want, as they are with the regime change wars. They're pushing as hard as they can. They're pushing as hard as they can in the Ukraine, even when they're losing that war. And they're pushing as hard as they can on controlling the information space and becoming increasingly authoritarian in doing so. Ultimately, they just diminish their credibility more and more by doing that. And they make more and more people like you, me, sort of willing to, right, well, I'll go out and I'll be independent and I'll stand my ground and speak the truth. And, however much mud you might sling at me, I'm going to stand my ground.
Are you concerned about the way AI has gotten to the point that, look, whether we were talking about the Gulf of Tonkin, whether we're talking about even the Syrian chemical weapon strikes, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, you can go down the list in regards to these kind of false flag conflicts. AI, and the ability of graphic software today is getting terrifying. And I would imagine, are you concerned that this notion of either false flags or this notion of propaganda gets worse, powered by basically fake events that can be created that effectively look real? That terrifies me in regards to the way that stuff is developing. Give me your take on it.
It's a concern because, ultimately, because AI allows fabrication, deception, obviously, and because the tool is out there, everyone can use it. But some people have got a lot of time and money and resources and have a vested interest in using it. And so, yes, it is a danger and it is a threat. Mm-hmm. I still think that people, can learn media literacy skills and just use their judgment and intelligence to think through. And this is what I always used to advise the students when you're reading mainstream media or any media, just think critically, think for yourself, and so on, look at other sources. So I think people still have an ability to navigate through that, but you're correct. It is a threat. At the same time, some people argue that AI is potentially, because people can sort of do one of these AI searches on a particular issue, and if it is genuinely an open AI search, it actually pulls together quite a wide range of information and so on. So it can be used to the advantage of people who want to try and get a more balanced or rounded understanding of what's going on. But then, as you say, sort of the problem is there are people with resources, time, PR professionals or propagandists who might exploit it. So it is a threat, and we just have to, as with all of these things, sort of work our way through it.
What would you think was the biggest psyop that was put on the public in the most recent years? And one last question before I let you go, before I don't want to forget the question. How do people guard against it? Like if a person, I remember I was having a conversation with this woman once and I asked her, where's the floor? Like where is, sometimes, because I know when I'm going through information, I'm usually doing multiple sources because I usually look at this stuff from the world's perspective. And sometimes they clash. There are certain areas where you say, okay, well, this makes sense. This makes more sense than not. But they're still sometimes very difficult to find a floor. When you're reading and you're looking through information, how do you like separate the wheat from the chaff? Is it really just I'm thinking through what I read to see whether or not this makes sense and that's the best that you got? How do you go through it for yourself?
Well, first of all, just being cautious about information that you're being given.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I think also people need to also have a broader understanding of propaganda, how media works. Herman Chomsky's propaganda model is a good sort of tool of intellectual self-defense. Understanding how propaganda is operated in previous cases, which we know about, gives you this kind of underlying ability to start to sift through information, understanding, as you were talking about, the geopolitical realities of the world, help. And then how do governments act in wartime? Well, they demonize the enemy and they whitewash their own crimes. There's a long history of this. So understanding that history is a useful sort of underpinning for people as they start to sift through and are cautious about different sources of information and so on. It's a big task, and I don't know, but it's a necessary task in a democracy. So I think that those are, people need to take a dual approach. One is trying to think for themselves, use their own intelligence, looking at a range of sources, but also go and read up on some history. Go and read up about the Vietnam War. Go and read up about the Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s. Look at these big political issues we've had manipulation going on. You asked me for the biggest ones, and you know, as I said at the start, 9/11 is a very major manipulation of the public mind in order to get the global war on terror going. COVID-19 also has a tremendous amount of manipulation of people's understanding going on. And these are what I tend to refer to as structural deep events. This is Peter Dale Scott's idea, that these are events which are instigated or manipulated by powerful groups in order to basically shape public opinion and behavior and so on. And a simpler way of looking at that is crisis. Political actors know that crises are opportunities to do a lot of things. So you have the claimed threat of Al-Qaeda terrorists or the claimed threat of a deadly virus. That allows you to then do lots of other things which people aren't really aware of. And of course, we've known this since the beginning of time, that the crises are political opportunities for powerful actors. So I suppose this is the last thing I'd say is that whenever the headlines and the politicians are screaming, you've got to be scared of that and we have to do this, just think for a second. It could be that this is completely genuine and they are acting with good intentions and full knowledge, etc. Or it could be that they're taking advantage of you, they're scaring you. The whole of the war on terror, look at all the wars we've had under the cover of the global war on terror. Look at all the death and destruction, underpinned by making people scared, at least initially, of terrorism, the threat of terror. That was used again and again in order to mobilize people, get people to sign up. And so I think that's, I think a big picture kind of understanding of how power and how political actors, being slightly casual here, but just love crises because it's an opportunity to do things. Always aware of that and always sort of think twice when, as I say, people are telling you to be scared. Because they might be telling you that because you don't actually have that much reason to be scared, but they just want to manipulate you. So that's a good learning point, I think, for people.
Piers, man, thank you for this. It's been such a long time since I've had you on. I really appreciate this. Thank you, Piers Robinson. He is co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. And Piers, where can people find you today?
Well, I'm on Twitter, Piers Robinson1. I'm research director at the International Center for 9/11 Justice. We have also, I run Propaganda and Focus, which is articles published by experts and academics on propaganda. But if people go to my Twitter handle, Piers Robinson1, you'll see in all the links to what I'm involved in, the work I do, and so on. So
cool.
They can find out.
Thanks,
Lots about
man.
propaganda, for example. My academic publications, a lot of those are public domain. So people can see the work I've done over the last 20, 25 years.
Piers Robinson, thanks again, man. I really appreciate this. Thank you for the conversation. I'm going. All right. Good conversation with Piers Robinson. Look, he's right about the propaganda thing. Part of the reason that I'm so adamant when it comes to issues of war, and I kind of get this sitting on the moon looking at events without friend or favor, is because I think war is a cancer on our society. And unfortunately, whereas we go with this idea that human life matters, like I often tell my mom, my value set comes from this country. It has to. There's nowhere else the value set can come from. And, you're taught life matters. It has intrinsic value. You should be honest in your dealings, et cetera, et cetera. And then when it gets to foreign policy sense, it's a law of the jungle. And we are perfectly okay in order to maintain this notion of supremacy of doing horrible things, whether that is backing head choppers, whether that is backing fascists in Ukraine, whether that is backing fascists in South America to overcome those governments, because that's our strategic domain in the way that we look at it. We will do it. We have done it. It is ghastly the way we do this stuff. And oftentimes, the American public doesn't necessarily accept that stuff whole cloth. Meaning, you can't necessarily go to the American public and say, hey, we just want to knock over this government for our strategic geopolitical interests. Typically, that's not the way it's done. In fact, it's getting more shallow, or either we're getting worse at it. I don't necessarily know which one it is. Maybe it's social media that has allowed the information to be more it has the information proliferated more. But I remember he mentioned the not Watergate, what was it called? The Iran-Contra affair. I remember being a kid when that was happening. And Colonel North, Lieutenant Colonel North, I believe, would come up for the interviews. I remember him raising his hand. He would sit there and he would say this amazing stuff. The American public was riveted over the things that he was effectively saying. I remember Ronald Reagan comes on TV. And in the old days, when the president used to come on, they used to have this picture of the White House. And then it would pan to the president who was sitting at the Resolute desk. And Reagan gave this astonishing speech where he pointed out, I'm the Gipper, the buck stops with me. I knew nothing about any of the stuff that was taking place. They were apparently selling weapons to the Iranians in order to get money so we can give it to kill squads in South America so they can go and kill people in order to prevent the Sandinistas from coming to power. And at the end of it, he was like, I didn't know anything about this, but I'm the Gipper and the buck stops with me. And it goes off. And you're sitting there like, what the hell did I just watch? Now, in those days, it was a big deal. Meaning when Reagan is sitting there saying that and exposing that to the American public is like, we were trying to knock over governments? We did that? I can't believe we did that. That's not what we're supposed to do. Meaning it was a shocking thing for the American public to be confronted with this idea that we knock over governments, the CIA knocking over these governments and everything else. We just, didn't process. Love and light. Fast forward to today, where you would get the New York Times publishing that Obama was trying to knock over the Syrian government and nobody cares. You would get this guy talking about knocking over governments, effectively saying we need to knock over these governments. It needs to be silent and it needs to be in a way that everybody knows that we did it. And again, nobody cares, meaning this stuff does come out from time to time of what our foreign policy is. Americans often are involved with other stuff, so they're not necessarily paying attention to the stuff. But I'm pointing out that whereas in Reagan day, they had this massive, I don't want to say outrage, but at the very least scandal over what Reagan was doing. These days, not so much. It just becomes old hand. This is just what our government does. This is Mike Morrell. And Mike Morrell, I don't remember when this conversation was taking place, but listen to what he says here. And I'm going to show you another conversation with John Kerry, where these guys are openly talking about knocking over governments. Specifically, I believe in this case, he's talking about Iran, but basically doing so in a way that's covert, but that other countries know that we did it as a warning to those other countries. Right here.
Covertly. So you don't tell the world about it, right? You don't stand up at the Pentagon and say we did this, right? But you make sure they know it in Moscow and Tehran. Here's the other thing I want to do. I want to go after those things that Assad sees as his personal power base, right? I want to scare Assad. So I want to go after his presidential guard. I want to bomb his offices in the middle of the night.
Well, that happened about 2 years ago. As you remember, when his brother-in-law was...
I want to destroy his presidential aircraft on the ground. I want to destroy his presidential helicopters. I want to make him think we're coming after him.
They did go after him. I want to bring in my guests. We're joined with the one and only Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri Lascaris is a lawyer, journalist, and activist from Montreal, Quebec. In 2020, Dimitri ran for leadership of the Green Party of Canada. Dimitri, man, I haven't talked to you in a very long time. How are you doing today? You doing all right?
I'm getting by. How about you, Jamal? Thank you for having me on your program. I appreciate it.
Oh, no, man. I wanted to get you on for a while to catch up. And there are all sorts of events that take place either in Canada or take place in the world. And I've seen you involved in some of these events, especially in relation to Gaza. And so I definitely wanted to bring you in. You've been somewhat outspoken on this issue. Over the past 2 weeks, give me your take in the rapidity of the fall of the Syrian government. I can't even call it a fall. It's more like collapse. What are your thoughts in all of this? And let's use this as an underpinning to step into the conversation. What are your thoughts?
I think there are basically two plausible explanations for what has happened, which are not, by the way, mutually exclusive. The one is that there was a secret backdoor deal involving, of course, Assad, which would see him and his family members being spirited off to Russia, where he would receive political asylum and be secure and retain whatever money, wealth he's managed to accumulate over the years, and to spirit out of Syria. And obviously, the Russians, if that deal happened as a precursor to the fall of Assad's government, it would have included in some way the Russians and presumably Erdogan. And I think very well it could have included directly or indirectly representatives of the United States and or Israeli governments. So that's one hypothesis, which I think is plausible. And the other is that simply the military of Assad was utterly decimated by years of warfare, the impoverishment of the country. I understand they were making something like $40 a month. I mean, you're going to risk your life for that kind of money, especially for a leader who is deeply unpopular with large swaths of the population. And the Turks, using their proxy, this HTS terrorist entity, chose the right moment to attack. And it was a moment not only when Assad's military and economy were crushed and demoralized, but the Russians were very much preoccupied with events in Ukraine, and the Iranians were preoccupied with their own, unfolding war with Israel, this sort of low-intensity war. So, as I say, it could be both. It could be that at some point after the assault began, a deal was done. I think it's very likely that at some point there was a deal done, which did involve Vladimir Putin and Erdogan, possibly also Iran, the U.S. and Israel.
Yeah, they were the Doha agreements. And look, it seemed that the Syrian soldiers didn't fight. I recently had Mark Sleboda on. He was on a little bit earlier. And he pointed out that he thinks that they were effectively paid off. He pointed out that they were hollowed out. Of course, the U.S. had Kurdish forces sitting on top of the oil fields and the wheat fields, so they couldn't necessarily get the oil and the wheat that would typically undergird the government itself. And, you know, many of those troops seem to have put down their weapons and went to Iraq, basically abandoning Syria in that sense. And,
Yeah.
you know, it's fascinating to be like the way that mainstream media has immediately flipped. The man has a $10 million bounty from killing Americans, beheading people, and everything else. And then all of a sudden, he's a moderate. And, you know, CNN is doing this softball interview as if they're talking to some random guy that, you know, went through this phase in life where he was chopping off heads and putting people in cages and burning them up. But then he, you know, realized that, yeah, that was wrong. I just want to be a different person now. I'm a better person. And, you know, I'm love and light. And I can now tolerate all of these minorities that I couldn't tolerate even in Idlib, but I can tolerate them now. This seems to be rather outrageous to me, but that is the way that they're selling him.
Yeah, as FDR said, you know, he may be a bastard, but he's our bastard.
He's our bastard. He's our monster.
Right.
I want to get talking about monsters. I want to play this other monster for you. I want to get your take on what I hate to play this. I'm sorry I hate to play this, but you know, it's a show. Netanyahu, because Syria, Netanyahu immediately attacked Syria in order to, they say, create a buffer zone for the Golan Heights, effectively stealing additional territory on top of the territory they had already stolen. And in this case, he's feeling pretty confident about himself, even going so far as to say that he was responsible in some way for this happening.
We gave the Israeli arms. This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime, the tyranny in Damascus, offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers. This collapse is a direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran, Assad's main supporters. It set off a chain reaction of all those who want to free themselves from this tyranny and its oppression. But it also means we have to take action against possible threats. One of them is the collapse of the Separation of Forces Agreement from 1974 between Israel and Syria. This agreement held for 50 years. Last night it collapsed. The Syrian army abandoned its positions. We gave the Israeli army the order to take over these positions to ensure that no hostile force embeds itself right next to the border of Israel. This is a temporary defensive position until a suitable arrangement is found. Equally, we send a hand of peace to all those beyond our border in Syria, to the Druze, to the Kurds, to the Christians, and to the Muslims who want to live in peace with Israel. We're going to follow events very carefully. If we can establish neighborly relations and a peaceful relations with the new forces emerging in Syria, that's our desire. But if we do not, we'll do whatever it takes to defend the state of Israel.
Give me your take on this. Is Israel really safe in this situation? I mean, up to this point, Al-Qaeda has not lifted a hand to go after Israel to any stretch of the imagination. I mean, in fact, what's wild about it, Erdogan had, 100,000 goons, give or take, at his disposal that he effectively used to hit Syria. And for all the talk that he was making about Israel, Netanyahu being Hitler, blah, 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 he used that against Syria, not against Israel or Netanyahu in regards to what Netanyahu was doing. Also, I saw various videos where they were extending a hand to Israel also and thanking Israel. A lot of people don't know this, but Israel had been putting money into these terrorist groups to undermine the Syrian government. Give me your take on what Netanyahu is saying there. What are your thoughts?
I first of all have to address this idea that the fall of Assad was due to his forceful action. This is complete bullocks. I mean, you know, and this raises a larger question, which is why does this little geopolitical pipsqueak, because that's what Israel is. It's a little tiny state with a very small population and very few resources that matter to the world, for example, oil and gas, that manages to project its power pretty much all over West Asia with brutal effect. Why is that? It's not because of the inherent superiority of Israel's military forces or its economy or its technology. It's because the United States government, which has by far the world's largest military budget, showers Israel with military industrial goodies year after year. Not only does that, provides them with battlefield intelligence. I'm sure that at some point during the past 14 months of horror, American forces and British forces have been engaged in some way. American aircraft, military aircraft have been employed to assist Israel. Israel could not do any of this without the United States. I'm not just talking about the downfall of Assad, but any domination, even of the Palestinian people, it couldn't do without the full-blown support of the global hegemon. When it comes to Assad in particular, effectively what happened, as you've indicated, is that Erdogan saved Netanyahu's ass. Netanyahu's military was incapable of occupying a significant portion of South Lebanon for any significant period of time. They sent their elite Golani brigade in there, had its ass handed to it, despite the fact that they completely disregarded the laws of war and were inflicting enormous suffering on the civilian population of Lebanon. They managed to prevent the Islamic resistance in Lebanon, managed to prevent the Israeli military, with all of its funding and wizardry and gimmicks and toys, of occupying any significant part of South Lebanon for a sustained period of time. So effectively what happened is that Erdogan, despite all of his rhetoric, as you indicated, his anti-Israel rhetoric, saved him, saved his military. That's what's happened here. I look at Netanyahu as a front man. That's the way we should see him. He's a front man for U.S. empire, and a very good front man, I should say. And he's also a way for the American government to place some distance between itself and the worst crimes it is perpetrating or enabling in West Asia and in other parts of the world. So, we've heard this whole rhetoric during the last 14 months of genocide where the Biden administration says, oh, I'm so frustrated and we're doing our best and we want a ceasefire. We're not happy with the amount of humanitarian aid. This is all bullocks. It has always been bullocks. Israel is doing exactly what the U.S. government wants it to do. And the front man simply gives the appearance of separation between the United States and these criminal activities in the region and all the horrible suffering that they entail. This is exactly what we're seeing in Syria. Now, in terms of the future and whether this, in fact, is going to enhance Israel's security, I think there's a very serious question about that. First of all, I don't think this man, Jolani, this terrorist, is going to last very long. I'd be very surprised. He's 42 years old. He's never governed a city, let alone a country. He has a force of tens of thousands of men at his disposal. He's very good at killing civilians. Maybe he's even a good military commander. But is this man going to actually be able to unify Syria, a country that is so diverse ethnically, religiously, where there's so much division, there's so much poverty, whose infrastructure is being destroyed, even as we speak, by U.S. forces and the Israeli military and the Turkish-backed jihadists? I mean, no, I don't see that. And I don't see that the Americans and the Israelis would tolerate this man in power for very long, assuming he ever does become the president of Syria. I think what we're more likely to see, if he stays in power, then I think that this could be, all bets could be off as to what happens. What they're going to want to do, I believe, is they're going to want to put in power somebody like Sisi in Egypt, who's a brutal, corrupt dictator, who will maintain, who will implement the wishes of the United States government in Israel to the detriment of the Syrian people. Or they're going to try to get somebody, a civilian leader like you have in Iraq, who kind of, there's at least a pattern of his having been democratically elected, but at the end of the day, he too is a puppet, and he does at the end of the day what his American masters tell him to do. That's the kind of scenario I think Syria is headed for. And if it doesn't, this could blow up and have very detrimental impacts, not only on Israel, but on the wider region.
I guess I'm looking at this kind of similar to Libya and Iraq, where it effectively imploded. And you had this kind of civil war that took place that had been going on for God knows how long. We champion this like it was a great thing, ignoring the fact that there are, as you pointed out, many minorities that are in Syria that are terrified right now, believing that this act of diversity at some point is going to go away when the rest of the world stop looking, and all of their lives are going to be at some level at stake.
And women. Let's not forget that. Half the population of
That's
Syria
right.
is probably terrified right now.
Oh man, the beach. Like I remember I was watching this thing where this woman was at the beach and you had people in bathing suits, bikinis, guys walking around with no shirt on. All of that's gone away, even under the best of circumstances. Like I don't think people get how fundamentally this country is going to change almost overnight as a result of these people taking over. From what happens to the resistance from here on out? I mean, all things being equal, Hezbollah has been, yeah, they were able to hold the line in regards to keeping them from coming into Lebanon. And even now, they've been exchanging fire back and forth. But for all intents and purposes, it seems that Gaza has been isolated in all of this. And it's even a question of whether or not Iran would be able to help or fund Hezbollah going forward. Because I agree with you. The person who's going to take power is going to be under this kind of Turkish, Americanish control. I mean, because again, these are Turkish forces predominantly. What do you think that means for the resistance going forward? I mean, do you think the Axis, do you think the government in power is going to work with any of these other groups, whether it's the Russians, whether it's the Iranians, or from your point of view, no, this is going to be Turkish, American, etc., Israeli friendly government. And that's assuming it doesn't fall apart. If it falls apart, all bets are off.
Well, in the near term, this is a serious problem for Hezbollah. There's no question about it. The land bridge to Hezbollah from Iran has been severed. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that Hezbollah almost certainly does have the capacity to produce some of its weaponry, particularly missiles, locally. I'm sure it's developed that capacity. It didn't want to simply put itself at the mercy of the land bridge. But is it going to be able to, develop the kinds of missiles which were the long distance precision missiles that threatened, areas in central Israel or southern Israel? I doubt it's going to be able to do that without supplies from some external source, principally Iran. So what this means, I think, is that Hezbollah is likely going to be forced to become a local insurgency, not insurgency, but military force that focuses almost exclusively on the protection of the Lebanese border in South Lebanon and the Shia population of Lebanon. That'll be its primary mission, and I think it's unlikely to be able to make any significant contribution to Palestinian resistance for the foreseeable future. Now, having said that, there are other resistance groups, and as a matter of fact, just today, Yemen launched a drone which, according to Israeli media reports, entered Egyptian airspace, traveled over Gaza, and struck a building in central Israel.
They're getting so much better at that.
Yes.
They're getting far more accurate.
And they're certainly not letting up in the Red Sea,
No.
and their activities there have caused the port of Eilat to go bankrupt, the only Red Sea port of Israel. Iran does have the ability to inflict very serious damage upon Israel through its hypersonic missiles. But it's been 6 weeks, I think, since Israel last attacked Iran. And
right, they haven't responded.
They haven't responded. The Iraqi militias are still there, and they do have the ability to cause trouble to Israel. But there's no question that the major point of pressure was coming from Hezbollah.
Right.
So this is a blow to the axis of resistance. This is a real problem for the Palestinian resistance. And all I can tell you, Jamal, is, and I've been saying this till I'm blue in the face, we in the West are going to need to step up our game to pressure our governments to bring this genocide to an end, because it doesn't appear that the armed resistance is going to be able to do that in the reasonably near future.
I'm curious on something else. The West Bank. So, well, Smotrich said it once before, but this seems to be policy at this point, where they're basically going to annex the West Bank. Elements of Gaza is also going to be annexed. I don't necessarily know how much, but clearly that's going to be the case. The opposition to Israel and this kind of greater Israel project seems to be diminished, with the axis of resistance being diminished, kind of proportional diminishment. What happens in Gaza and the West Bank from here on out? I mean, if they annex the West Bank, what happens to the Palestinians that are living under the territory that they steal?
Well, either they're going to be forced into some other country like Jordan, or they are going to be annihilated, or some combination of the two. This is where this is heading, Jamal. I mean, if you let Israel get away with what it's doing in Gaza, why wouldn't it expand its genocidal project to the West Bank?
Yeah.
It just carried out a genocide before the eyes of the world, the most publicized genocide probably in human history, and nobody is held account. Not one soldier, not one military leader, not one civilian leader. So the Israelis are looking at this situation and going, hell yeah, let's just finish the job and rid ourselves of the Palestinian people once and for all. That's inevitably what's going to happen unless they're stopped. They're prevented from completing their genocidal rampage in Gaza. And frankly, I see no indication that there are any red lines in the halls of power in the West when it comes to Israel's behavior. They do appear to have decided to go all in and to give Israel carte blanche to commit any crime, any atrocity that it so desires.
That is, oh man. I mean, and look, I don't see any change for Trump from his standpoint. Joe Biden, I agree with you for all the grumbling at the basically gave a blank check.
Yeah.
What do you say to those people who say this is not the tail wagging, this is not the dog wagging the tail, this is the tail wagging the dog? Because I think I agree with you. This is U.S. policy, regardless of what Joe Biden says. Ultimately, the settler colonial state and the expansion of that state in the Middle East seems to be the goal, an objective, going all the way back to the Bush administration, who was going after Syria in order to hit Iran. And even Wesley Clark pointing out that Iran is next on the list, that every country that Wesley Clark pointed to at this point has been destroyed, with Iran being the last man standing up to this point. I guess from your point of view, where does this go? Do you think Jelani in the U.S., or for that matter, Turkey, is going to be able to keep the government intact before the government falls apart? Where do you think this ultimately goes?
Well, in terms of whether the tail is wagging the dog or vice
sorry,
versa, no, I just want to, focus the discussion on, what U.S. military planners and civilian leaders were saying at the time of Israel's creation. They were saying, this was immediately in the aftermath of the Second World War, that the oil resources of West Asia were a stupendous source of strategic power. That's the way they described it, and one of the greatest material prizes in human history. And they were quite right about that. You have a global economy that is dependent upon oil, and there's a sea of, easily accessible, high-quality oil, even today, in the region. And that was the reason why, in my opinion, the United States was the very first government to recognize the state of Israel after the Zionist militias declared independence. And they have been pumping weaponry into Israel ever since. It is, I think, instructive to think of Israel as a giant U.S. military base masquerading as a country. It is there. It is America's rabid dog in a region which is of vital importance to the project of Western government, U.S. hegemony in the world. So where this goes from here, I think that has always been the objective, and that's the fundamental reason why the U.S. political and military elites have given Israel so much support over the years. They use Zionism as an ideology, as a tool to justify their crimes and their support for Israel. But the objective is one of not raw, naked power, in my opinion, the ultimate objective. Where this goes from here, I don't want to sound like I'm pessimistic about the future of the Palestinian people, because I'm actually not. Precisely because Israel depends so much on American power to exist in its current form as an apartheid, lawless state. If America's power declines, Israel's power will decline necessarily. And America's power is in decline. We are transitioning to a multipolar world, and however hard and desperately the U.S. government and the U.S. elite attempts to maintain a position of global dominance, that project is doomed. And when it ultimately fails, Israel will have to become a law-abiding citizen in its neighborhood. There's just no two ways about it. And I don't know when that's going to happen. And there's definitely going to be a lot of people killed before we get there. It could be, a few years, it could be a decade or more. But I think that this is ultimately going to end in the destruction of the Israel that we have known up until now. And it's just a question of when, not if.
And okay, I think I understand what you mean by that. The Israel that we've known up to now, basically a murderous state that doesn't have borders, that can
Correct.
kill, expand without any kind of consequences, into a state that is a normal state like any other state and is held to the same regulations as any other state. No, I do understand. Dimitri, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it. I've wanted to get you on for a while, so I'm glad that you hit me back. Thank you for this. Dimitri
Thank you.
Lascaris, he's a lawyer, journalist, and activist from Montreal, Quebec. In 2020, Dimitri ran for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. By the way, where can people find you, Dimitri?
So my main gig at the moment is my YouTube program, Reason to Resist. You can find me on YouTube at Dimitri Lascaris 3051, or just put in Reason to Resist. I'm also very active on X, and my handle there is at Dimitri Lascaris.
At Dimitri Lascaris. Very cool, man. Thank you for this. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Jamal.
All right. And I cut him off too fast. I am sorry for that. No, I appreciate this conversation. In fact, I appreciated all of these conversations. We have one more coming up, and that's going to be KJ, and he is here. He has arrived. As you remember, we were having a conversation about the coup that attempted, or the coup attempt that took place in North Korea. And the people of South Korea were brave, strong, and they came out with a fervorance like nobody's business in order to protect their government. Despite the fact that they had military, police, and everything else that was basically bearing down on them. Parliament went in, Parliament struck down the order to create the dictatorship, basically declaring martial law. And there was a question of whether or not and what the president was going to do. Ultimately, the president relented. But now the president is being told that he can't leave the country because they're doing an investigation. And honestly, from my standpoint, he should be prosecuted and put in a cage. It is outrageous that he was trying to overthrow the government. One of the questions is why? Why then? And I know they may point out and say, well, he couldn't get anything through. But I think it's strange and coincidental that this has been taking place in Romania and Georgia. You now have the overthrow in Syria, and you had a dictatorship declared in North Korea. And I guess the question is, are these things unrelated to one another? I want to bring in our guests. We're joined with the one and only KJ No. KJ No is, there we are. There we are. Come on, there we are. KJ No is a lawyer, journalist. Oh, KJ, I'm sorry. I have the wrong bio for you. I have to get the right bio for you. This is my mistake. But KJ, as a journalist, academic, I'm not mistaken, professor even, of the Asia Pacific region. And you are my go-to person for anything that happens in Asia or in the Asia region. Thank you for joining me, man. How you doing this morning? You doing okay? Well, it's not morning for you. What is morning for you? It's 6 a.m. for you.
Yes.
It is morning for you. 6:30.
Yes. Anything for you, Jamal.
Well, yeah, I'm up very early every morning trying to get this stuff straight. But thank you, man. I really appreciate you joining me on this. I have been fascinated by this coup attempt, just for not the absurdity of it, the balls of when nothing else is going on. He comes out of the blue and says, you know, this is martial law. The other party or my opposition is working with the North Koreans, which is just outrageous. And because they're working with the North Koreans, I need to, ironically, preserve democracy by destroying democracy. And the people, give them credit, they aggressively push back on this. President Young Suk Yeol, they push back on it strongly. He apparently given orders to not allow people into the parliament, despite the fact that under South Korean law, the parliament gets a say in whether or not it goes through, meaning whether or not the martial law goes through. Parliament has the right to potentially vote it down. In this case, Parliament did vote it down, and they were under assault as they were voting it down. You can see the people with the cameras, with the barricades, trying to hold out, I guess, either the military or police that were coming in to try to stop Parliament from making the vote. Like very dramatic scenes in this case. I want to get into your article on this because you wrote this great article for Counterpunch. South Korea's martial law fiasco, legitimate crisis in imperial vassal state. I guess my first question is, do you think this is unrelated from the other either coups or attempted coups taking place around the world, either in Georgia, either in Romania, Syria, or in this case, North Korea. Meaning, did this puppet do this of his own volition, or did he do this because they believe that A, Donald Trump is coming into office, and when Donald Trump comes into office, he will most likely, I don't know, either make amends in Syria, maybe they think that, like pull the troops out or something like that for good, make amends with North Korea in the North Korea-South Korea conflict. Like, meaning, do you think that this stuff is all related in some way? That he didn't just do this on a random day at 11 o'clock at night. He did this because there was somewhat of a push for him to do it, knowing that he would get backing as he did it. What is your thoughts on this, KJ?
Yeah, I think there are two ways to, two opinions about this. One is that certainly he was enabled over a period of years to go ahead and do anything that he wanted in Korea. I mean, he has been a dictator, this incredible authoritarian grinding the Korean people down under his boot heel. And this entire period, the US has been touting him as the leader of a pivot state fighting for democracy. So you keep pumping somebody up with that kind of, mendacity, that kind of propaganda, it's going to go to his head. So it's clearly, essentially, he thought that he could ape what his masters are doing all around the world. I think there was a bit of monkey see, monkey do going on here. And it's clear that, martial law means military dictatorship, right? And what he did was he used a backdoor in the Constitution to declare a military dictatorship. And he almost stole home. If it hadn't been for, thousands of people running out, tossing off their pajamas and running out, this would have been fait accompli. But we know that this was deeply planned in South Korea's deep state. And that South Korean deep state is an appendage of the US deep state, of the US national security state. The US created South Korea. They created its military and political institutions. They created the military academy. They form all of the top politicians. And they also control the culture, which is another topic. But the key thing to understand is the South Korean military is an appendage of the US military. It's created by the US, trained by the US. It's military culture training, it's it's uniforms, weapons, rank, command structure, equipment. It's all US. It's a clone of the US military. It's doctrine and war plans. And there's no way that the Korean military would have taken this kind of drastic action, sending in special forces troops into the national security National Assembly building without the U.S. at least knowing about it. Without the U.S. knowing about it, yeah.
Well, the reason why I think it in these terms, because the last time Donald Trump was in office, Donald Trump, A, got rid of the troops in Syria. B, he made deals with North Korea, meaning he went to North Korea, and there was this hope that North Korea and South Korea were going to get closer together over the course of that administration. And I remember they did get closer over the course of that administration. Maybe not to the point of ending the war, but definitely closer. And if Donald Trump, if they think for the moment, if they're thinking to themselves, and for the another example is Ukraine. Donald Trump kept saying, I'm going to end the war in Ukraine. Or in each of these cases, you've seen escalation in Ukraine with this idea of trying to Trump-proof Ukraine. At one point, you've seen a dictatorship try to be declared in North Korea, again, under the model that Donald Trump is going to come in and maybe make some kind of deal with North Korea in order to put this issue to bed,
Yes.
or at the very least find it again.
Correction, South Korea.
Korea, I'm sorry. Thank you, South Korea.
South Korea, yes.
Well, I guess my point is Donald
Yeah.
Trump was willing to meet with North Korea last time. And I guess my thing is it really that much of a coincidence that all of the places that Donald Trump either had influence or did something last time just so happened just before his administration takes office, all exploded? I don't think there is. And I agree with you. Like, I don't know if they necessarily take that step without telling the U.S. that they're taking that step.
I agree with you. I mean, everywhere where Donald Trump could affect the outcome, we're seeing these drastic, shocking,
Escalations.
escalations and changes happening all at once. So I don't think that is a coincidence. Specifically in the case of South Korea, Donald Trump had declared that once he becomes president, he's going to change the burden sharing and increase it by 9-fold. What does that mean? South Korea pays about $1.3 billion per year to the US military for the privilege of being occupied. They pay for that privilege. What Donald Trump had said is, I'm going to raise this 9-fold. You're going to pay me $10 billion. That's like 1/5 of South Korea's military budget. You're going to pay that all to me. That would have been a deal breaker. And then Donald Trump could have said, then if you don't, I'm going to withdraw troops, et cetera, et cetera. Now, because they were afraid of that, what they did was they very rapidly redid the agreement so that they would raise it to $1.8 billion per year, and they tried to seal that so that it will stay that way for the next few years. But all of this signals is that Donald Trump sees Korea in a very transactional way, just as he sees Taiwan in a very transactional way. He says, they're going to have to pay insurance to us. We're just an insurance policy. They need to pay us insurance. Same thing with South Korea. He's saying that, South Korea, you want American troops on your soil, you need to pay us more. Now, what he doesn't understand is that it's the US that wants to be there. It's not the South Koreans that want US troops. The South Koreans would be perfectly happy if the US left and if they didn't have to keep paying this, quote, protection. But because the US needs South Korea as a force projection platform against China. It is the greatest force multiplier in this escalation to war against China because it has 500,000 active duty troops and 3.1 million reserve troops. In other words, 3.6 million troops that the United States has eminent domain over, what they call wartime OPCON. The moment the US decides that it wants these troops, it declares DEFCON 3, and then it gets operational control over 3.6 million troops. That's why it wants South Korea. That's why it wants to be present. That's why South Korea is so important. And that's why it always wants heightened tensions with North Korea, because that's just a pretext to escalate and to keep a military presence in order to prepare for war against China. That's the larger context. Donald Trump potentially could have thrown a wrench into those works. It's hard to predict ahead, but this is one scenario that could have been considered. So under those situations, it is not surprising that Yoon, who is one of the most unpopular presidents in South Korean history, he's below 20%, would decide that he was going to declare himself military dictator. Remember, martial law means military dictatorship. And I'm quite certain that if he had been successful, and he almost was, the US would have been, okay, that's okay. They're fine with head choppers. They're fine with fascists and Nazis taking power. I don't think they would have been that upset with Yoon going full military dictatorship, because the US supported military dictatorships for 4 decades on the Korean Peninsula. So this would have not been, something unusual. In fact, this period of liberalization was really a reversion away from the norm.
I'm curious. I was reading your article, and just so the audience can see what I am talking about. And one of the things you question is legitimacy of democracy if this can take place so casually. And I'm saying casually, but if democracy is not so well worn that a leader could come out on I think it was a Tuesday night or Wednesday night or something like that, just a random night, and say, I am now dictator of South Korea, and even take steps to prevent parliament from getting a question of that order that he's putting through. I mean, that stuff is outrageous. Clearly, he had additional help with it. I think part of the point that you were making, correct me if I'm wrong, is this puppet really a democracy in the clearest sense of the word, in the way that the U.S. touts it as, if this could take place? And to be fair, those people fought for that government, whatever you want to call it, I swear. And even now, apparently, they still don't trust the president, where they are like waiting, like there are some parliamentarians that are apparently sleeping in parliament, and you have some people that are kind of staying by in this kind of close protest because they're not necessarily sure if he's going to do this again and declare martial law again. Give me your take. What were you trying to get to in the article? Am I getting across one of the themes of this article correctly? And if so, great. If not, correct me. But also fill in what I'm missing out in regards to explaining this article.
No, I think that's a pretty good summary. What I'm pointing out is this is a legitimation crisis around South Korea, which was touted as one of the most important and impressive democracies in the world. I mean, the US always touts South Korea as a model democracy. It's the teacher's pet of US imperialism. You know, look what Korea can do: economic development, K-pop, K-drama, Samsung, right? And it wants and needs South Korea as this like capitalist show pony. But what is really underneath that facade is that it is a deeply authoritarian state that does its master's wishes. And this is true of many of its vassals, if not all of them. And what we see here is that South Korea's much vaunted democratic system is shown not to be democratic. You know, the code had a backdoor straight into fascist dictatorship, right? And there's a two-factor ID authentication, which was immediately disabled. And it's only because of the vigilance of the Korean people and literally bodies thrown on the line, bodies thrown against martial law troops, that this coup was thwarted. And as you pointed out, you know, there are people, there are legislators sleeping in the National Assembly because they do not want to be blockaded out like they almost were on Tuesday evening. So it's all being held up by an improvised patch. And now we can see that the coup plotters are preventing a reversion to ordinary processes because they just blocked the impeachment, right? This president is guilty of insurrection, of treason against the government. So they shut down the martial law decree because they were able to do parkour, 60-year-old men doing parkour over the fences, body slamming their ways through, barricades of police. They ran in, they go inside, they see that the paratroopers are coming down with helicopters, and they blockade the national security doors, with, furniture and cabinets. It's like the Paris Commune all over again, I mean, they just pile up so much stuff, and it's just enough to keep the paratroopers from breaking in. And they are able to pass within, 15, 20 minutes, probably the fastest legislative motion in the history of South Korean politics, a rescission, a rebuke of the martial law. But just the fact that this could happen tells you that this is not a democracy. I mean, this could have been fait accompli, if any tiny thing had not happened. And this is a man guilty of insurrection. The president is guilty of insurrection. They were going to vote on impeachment. And when the time to vote on impeachment happened on Saturday, the ruling party, they walked out of the legislative chambers. They turned their back to the people and walked out of the legislative chambers. And there was not quorum enough to actually pass this impeachment of a president guilty of insurrection. And so what that shows us is that right now, the country is in a not just a constitutional crisis, it is in a legitimation crisis. And they're saying, oh, we want to do, we don't like what he did either. We agree we have to take the car keys away from this, drunk immediately. But they're not doing the thing that is provided for in the Constitution, which is when you have somebody who has broken the Constitution, president has broken the Constitution, he gets removed. They're saying, we don't want that. We want an orderly transition. And right now, the president is not doing anything. The prime minister and the party leader are, administering the country. But that's not possible because the Constitution does not allow for that. There is no such thing as a kind of informal transfer of power inside the Korean Constitution. If the president is not functioning properly, he resigns or he's impeached. And then within 60 days, you have to hold a new election. And that's what they don't want, because they don't want to lose power. And the US doesn't want them to lose power, because if that happens, all these deals, South Korea, coordinating with Japan and preparing for war against China, all of that could go out the window.
It is astonishing to me that he is not impeached. I swear it is. I mean, meaning if they accept that it was improper for him to try to overthrow the government, then how do they How do they create an argument to say that? I mean, even his own party was against them and trying to overthrow the government. So how do they make this kind of argument that no, we shouldn't take him out of office? Also, I agree with you. We're talking about law, meaning we're not talking about people just subjectively coming up and figuring out doing whatever. If you were at a high school band meeting, okay, fair enough. We're talking about running a country, a major economy. And they're saying, well, the president is not doing anything. We have some other group of people that have come together to do the president's job. It's like, okay, well, I don't know what that is, right?
But that's a coup. That's a coup itself, because as I said, there is no provision in the Korean Constitution for the president to transfer power to anybody else. And none of these people are elected. The party leader is a private party. He's the leader of a private organization. He has no, mandate to rule, legitimacy, and neither does actually the prime minister. The prime minister is just a caretaker, and he takes power for 60 days once the president, resigns or, is something happens to him. So this is completely extrajudicial, extra-constitutional, extra-administrative. It's extraordinary. And the fact that they're trying to justify it under the pretext of that they want an orderly transition, that term orderly transition is a euphemism, meaning that they don't want to give up power. And they don't.
I'm sorry, when is the next election, by the way?
Well, the next election would happen in 3 years.
Whoa.
But yes, exactly, right? Whoa. This is like, so he served 2 years and it's a 5-year term. So there would be another 3 years. But as I said again, in the United States, you have the 20th Amendment. There is orderly succession. You complete the term, with the vice president or the Speaker of the House. The South Korean structure doesn't have a vice president. You only have new elections, and those new elections have to happen within 60 days. So right now we are in completely uncharted territory. It's like what Zelensky is doing in Ukraine. It's like complete, essentially this is already a coup. The fact that they didn't impeach him means they have already implemented a coup.
The cops are apparently looking into or investigating him, correct? Is he being investigated currently for crimes against the South Korean government?
Yes, he is technically being investigated. They put, according to the police, they put 150 investigators on his tail, and they're investigating for insurrection. Any other crime he could claim presidential immunity because he is still the president. but he's being investigated for insurrection. The problem is we don't think that he can be properly investigated because the police, the chief of police was involved in this coup. He transmitted the orders for, the police to cordon off the National Assembly. And then there's also a separate investigating body, which is the prosecutor's office. And they want also to investigate him because they say, the police, the police brass are also subjects or should be subjects of investigation. But the thing is, the prosecutor's office is actually controlled by the president. The president was the former chief prosecutor. And when he was elected, he said that he would turn the country into a country of prosecutors, which he did. And he used the prosecutorial body as simply his private army to go after everybody. And so they want to get involved as well. And there's a bit of a turf fight between these two agencies. But all of that signals that this investigation is not going to work. And as I said, we're looking at a serious constitutional crisis as well as a foundational legitimation crisis. That said, they have put an exit ban on the president, which is, once again, astounding. He's the first sitting president who's been told that he cannot, exit the country. So the absurdities just pile up and up and up.
How in the world does that work? How do you can you imagine a head of state not being able to visit another country or another head of state because he's being investigated by the cops? Just astonishing.
Exactly.
You don't believe the investigation is going to work. Meaning you believe that the way to deal with this is constitutionally through impeachment, and that the federal, the legal system is not going to be able to go after him in the way that. Well, I guess that's the other question.
So he's still president. You see, he's
Right.
still president. He's still the sitting president. He has all the full powers of the sitting president, and
Can the
therefore,
president be
So,
investigated? Meaning,
if
can they take him out of office if he's convicted, for example?
this is unknown territory. This is unknown territory. But more than that, because he is still the sitting president, he could simply declare martial law again. He is the commander in chief of the military. He could simply tell the military, we don't agree with that. He can still declare another martial law. So all of this is, it's just a complete fiasco. It's a foundational legitimation crisis. And as I said, once again, it just puts the lie that this is some kind of model democracy. It's like a Potemkin state that was propped up because it was an important U.S. vassal, U.S. threat projection platform, U.S. force multiplier, U.S. base against China. Essentially, it's like Israel, right? I mean, I don't want to overuse that, but just as Israel gets away with anything, South Korea gets away with anything. And genocide, South Korea is built on genocide. I mean, in 1948, full-blown genocide happened. Hundreds of thousands of people just wiped out. If you dig anywhere in Korea, you are going to run into a mass grave. I mean, the longest mass grave in Korean in the world is in South Korea. I think it's like 3 kilometers, 2 kilometers long, and they have at least 150 sites that have been unexcavated but are considered to be mass graves. So the entire country was built on genocide by the United States. As I said, it's an appendage of Washington. And they've declared martial law 12 times. This is the 13th time. Each time they declare martial law, it's some kind of massive travesty. I mean, it is the most, when you say martial law declaration or emergency martial law declaration in the Korean language, it is the most frightening phrase in the Korean lexicon, in the Korean dictionary. Everybody goes back immediately to images of mass graves, beatings, torture, disappearances. That's what the Koreans were afraid was happening, that this was just Groundhog Day for them. And that's why people rushed out, at 10:30, and they went so fast that they were able to arrive at the National Security Building before the special forces and their helicopters were able to blockade it. That's how fast they were doing. Like I said, 60-year-old parliamentarians doing parkour, not just one, multiple parliamentarians doing parkour over the national security fences in order to get inside the building and blockade themselves. And
Last
vote.
question, KJ. Who else associated with the president was involved in this? He couldn't have done this by himself. I mean, the fact that the military was going to the parliament kind of gave some level of indication that someone else had to be involved in what he was doing.
Yeah, we think that there are a bunch of them, but probably the most important or influential person was the Minister of Defense, and who's a very, very close, high school buddy of his. And then the Minister of Interior, and then the Minister of Security, National Security, and then the Defense Security Command. They've given it another name, but this is kind of like the intelligence security force. And they had these plans, and it's come out now that they had plans for, a second day. They were going to move paratroopers from the south into the capital. Huge military mobilization and movements, which means that the US had to have known, because you can't do that kind of huge movement because it's such a crowded dance floor with all these, weapons pointed at each other. So the moment you do any kind of military movement, you have to notify the command authority, which is the CNC, CFC, USFK commander, which is the United States. That would have gone to US, Joint Command leader, and then that would have gone up to Indo-PACOM, that would have gone to the Joint Chiefs, that would have gone all the way up to the White House. And that is why I think that as the coup was happening, the United States didn't condemn it. They said, we're watching, and South Korea is one of our closest allies, right? That's all they could say. We know that there were follow-up plans on this coup. It was planned with intricate detail. It was a huge mobilization. They were going to arrest 11 parliamentarians, including the head of his own party, and take them away to like a black site. So this was ugly, ugly stuff, pure insurrection, pure treason. And yet, the US approaches, okay, you do your thing. That's fine. We didn't see anything, or, you are still our best buddy. We're still with you.
That is, KJ, that's astonishing, man. I agree with you. I don't believe for a moment that these things are unrelated. And I strongly suspect that a lot of this has to do with Trump, meaning their perspective of what Trump may do, and they are receding into the rest of the world, this kind of multipolar world. But KJ, man, thank you for this. KJ, no, he's a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He's a contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is now available at iacenter.org. KJ, man, always appreciate you. Thank you for this. I really appreciate your analysis.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. And you can find me on the China Report on the Breakthrough News Network.
China Report. Okay. On the Breakthrough News Network. I'm going to write that down. Thank you, KJ. Have a good one, man. Be safe.
Thank you.
All right. We have come to the end of the show. I want to thank all of you. KJ is awesome. Look, man, I really do believe that this is, but the reason why I say that, if you think of what Trump did last time, he made a deal with North Korea in order to stop the missiles from firing. He went to Syria and he effectively pulled the troops out of Syria, basically ending Obama regime change war, even though he stole the oil. And if you're thinking of Europe in general, let's say the EU, for example, well, Joe Biden is losing the war in Ukraine, but just it's obvious at this point. Somebody would have to be cultish to not think that Ukraine is failing miserably. Hell, even Zelensky himself point out that he doesn't have the power in order to do anything, in order to stem the Russian events. And so if you're thinking of Georgia as a second front, and you're looking at it, even when they offered NATO membership, if you remember back in 2008, Georgia was one of the countries that was listed with the US associated with Ukraine. So you get a Georgian government that is becoming far more skeptical of Europe than it was prior, meaning Europe feels like it's losing Georgia. And their response is, well, the only way you have a democracy if you fall in with the European Union. And then you get Romania, who you get a Eurosceptic who also is looking for Romanian interests and say us being a part of this war is not in Romanian interests. And Europe comes in and says, well, this election, we don't believe that the election was fair, so you guys need to run the election over again. The court even comes through and say, we think there were TikTok videos, and because there were TikTok videos that amplified the campaign, we are going to run this election over again, basically killing the fact that the guy won and was most likely going to win the second election that night. And so if indeed Trump touches at the very least these other items, North Korea, and Trump touches Syria, then maybe it's not that much of a coincidence that Syria gets killed just before Trump gets in office, something that Trump might have pulled out of or not having anything to do with. And North Korea, maybe it's the feeling that it can't necessarily be trusted to toe the line completely if indeed it was a democracy as opposed to being a dictatorship. The US didn't seem to complain about the fact that the guy was overthrowing the government. So I would imagine if they didn't complain, maybe they were on board with the fact that he was doing it. I don't know. I mean, you can only see what's above and only from below, as Candace put it. But look, I'm going to end this. We have one chat for today, Mama Thomas. Let's see what Mama Thomas is saying. Jamal, great guess. Whatever is going on in the world, you always have someone who knows what's going on. Keep up the good work. Well, Mama Thomas, I appreciate you giving me accolades and all that good stuff. Some people might say you're biased in this case, but I don't believe you're biased at all. But look, I'm going to end this. Guys, I'm going to say like, share, subscribe. You can always support this work through PayPal or Patreon, or for that matter, Super Chat. All stickers will be read, provided you're not racist, sexist, or bigoted. If you dig the content, definitely give it a like. And like I said, share it far and wide. My objective is to reach 40,000 by the end of the year. Damn it, I think I can do it. I can do it with your help. So definitely share this content, like this video, and I will see you guys at the worst or at the latest, bright and early tomorrow morning. You guys have a fantastic day. Jamal Thomas Morning Show. Signing off.